And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, down in the underground, you'll find someone true, a land so pure, a crystal moon. Well, we're going deep, deep underground to find the Hall of Records, the famed Hall of Records beneath the Giza Plateau that was predicted in the late 20s and in great detail in 1932 by Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet. And as the years have gone by and Cayce suffered ridicule and so on, we see more and more now that with radar scans, with weather testing, with all these other things, that Cayce was in fact absolutely right, which is quite exciting because of the things he was saying were deep, deep beneath the Giza Plateau, and that includes the Atlantis Pyramid. That is Pyramid X, the Hall of Records, which has all the knowledge, one, of the TUAOI stone, and it also has what is known as the 32 tablets, which lay out humanity's kind of incarnation from the spirit into Atlantis. Quite fascinating, and it goes deeper still. We're going to get into all of it tonight in this very special episode. This is X Series 221, Going Deep, the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records Pyramid Breakthrough. And that also includes a deep look at the mystery schools preparing the culture for what's to come, and the secret societies ready to block all of it. And I mean 100%, and spin it in exactly the wrong direction. You wanted post-disclosure, baby? You came to the right place. It's so great to have so many of you here. Of course, we just came off of the Alex Jones show.
Mm-hmm.
We did a fantastic, we did a couple hours with Alex yesterday, and it's fantastic when Alex is on this subject of the UFO file, but we also looked at a number of things like remote viewing, mystical experience, reincarnation. I mean, it ran the gamut. And I think Alex is doing a real service in terms of putting these things front and center. We know the amount of extreme censorship that there is around this show. And we get, we're doing over 6.5 million viewers.
Wow.
During the 2 hours of the Alex Jones show yesterday. That type of, getting out of the cloud cover of the censorship is phenomenal, and it's absolutely radical. And this is what Alex is known for, of course. He has the courage to push the issues forward, and he also knows that, especially in the realm of the kind of UFO threat disclosure movement that they're doing, there's only so much time to get ahead of them on this, on the schedule. And we've seen that they've moved the schedule up dramatically. That's apparent through the actions of Barack Obama, for example, and then, of course, Trump with the follow-up saying we're going to release everything, and all of the strange things that have happened since. We're going to get into that tonight. But the show is really about the Sphinx, which has been in the news because of the reports of the double Sphinx, this kind of Sphinx 2 maybe hanging out there in the desert. And some of the very interesting space scans. Now, we did a documentary last summer called Pyramid X, which got a great response. But again, this is the type of information that they don't want getting out. That Pyramid X contains all of this information about the Hall of Records, and it's so crucial because they really have controlled access to that plateau for a long, long time. And so we have some people working with space radar and getting kind of fantastic results. And there are other people using a kind of wait and see type approach, which I can totally appreciate in terms of the scans. However, it's not just the space scans. We've known for a long, long time. They did sound acoustic scanning as early as 1992 on this. The people who were ahead of the pack, Robert Shaw, Graham Hancock, and others, at times were literally booted off the plateau by Zahi Hawass. And there's a whole section in Pyramid X called Giza Gate, which gets into why they were doing that, including the fact that the Cayce Foundation was funding the very people that they thought were, going to find the Hall of Records. And those people were using the money to kick the other people out and run phony, like, oh, I found Nefertiti's DNA specials, National Geographic handing over $5 million to Hawass. I mean, this is a scandal and a half. But they made Hawass a government official in the Egyptian government. And then that government of Mubarak's fell under corruption. And of course, Mubarak went to jail. The army took over, and we know how that all went. So it's been very, very interesting, shall we say. But there's always intrigue and political intrigue around the archaeology wars. And that's what we're going to get into tonight, because right in the heart of it is the Hall of Records from the Atlanteans, transported to found the Egyptian culture, and not founded according to normal historical timelines of 3000 BC for the kickoff of the dynasties. Those records were largely made in the 18th century. And how accurate would you expect them to be now? But Cayce's taking us back to 10,500 BC. And guess what? He says when they're putting it there, they're already putting it over the ruins of a much, much older temple of Isis. That's how far back this goes. So those guys in 10,500 BC were doing archaeology. Where does that take us? You can tell we're going we're going into the antediluvian past, and it's going to open up some major questions. We're also going to take your questions, speaking of questions, tonight in the second half of the program. And I did want to say that many of you got in touch with me after Alex's show. The show was just off the charts, and a number of you got in touch with me in relation to the missing general reports that we've been doing, and we've done 3 of those. We got ahead of the whole pack. I sensed immediately that the pattern of these scientists and generals and other people associated at Los Alamos and Wright-Patterson, it was ringing bells immediately, and we were doing shows on it as early as January. Nuno Loureiro up here, of course, got assassinated over at MIT. That was part of this pattern and the kickoff of this pattern. So those shows that we've done, a lot of people who wrote to me, they were saying, why are they sort of getting rid of these people now? And we're going to do a follow-up to all of the missing generals and the UFO aspect around this. Of course, he was in charge of the largest UFO program over there at Wright-Patterson, but he had also been associated with Kirtland, and that is, of course, Major General William Neal McCaslin. So you can refer to those 3 episodes that we did all in a row leading up to this one. And I covered a lot of it in Alex's show yesterday, but the one that we have coming up will answer a lot of these broader questions about who they were in relation to each other. And this is even information that I've given to major publications, and they're using it like over in the UK and other places. But what I would say is this: they are taking down a team there, and the team is concerned. The idea is basically we can't have people who have knowledge of this aspect of the UFO file and being loose cannons. And so the X-Protect group is coming out in a very kind of forceful and colorful way, a way that they don't normally do. They're usually very careful and in the background. And so the X-Protect group, who has sort of elected themselves to hide the secrecy, and they've installed the wall of secrecy. And when they've gone in for the co-opting of the UFO file, it's very interesting because they're spinning the threat aspect as the way that they can kind of create this UFO defense office, which in fact already exists. And there's a whole kind of Earth control grid in relation to this. But they want to make it official and go from black budget on budget. And that's going to be trillions of dollars for them, including this Golden Dome, which is already scheduled to be $300 billion. That's Star Wars 2, even out of Trump's own lips in relation to that. And I'll tell you, I think there's even, you can see why they'd be putting the Golden Dome in place in some ways. But what it's actually for is being hidden, and that's a big, big problem. That is a UFO defense grid, and it's going to become a major dumping ground for laundering this money that's coming out of the black budget. I would also say that it represents a danger because the people that are being involved with developing it, like Anduril and Palantir, are well known to do massive surveillance for the governments. And so we need to really keep an eye. I can't tell you how important this project is to keep an eye on what they're doing and what they're doing around the messaging of the UFO file and releasing this disclosure pitch for, the movies, for example, that are coming out. Of course, Spielberg's movie Disclosure Day, that's a major one. That's going to hit in June. That's June. They already have the Lazar movie out, which is ridiculous. They've already exhausted the Lazar train, but they keep putting money and attention into it. Of course, Lazar was just on Joe Rogan. And, it's unfortunate. I mean, in fact, Lazar engaged in criminal activity, and he was, running a brothel. But beyond that, he was doing surveillance on the people, the Johns that they were getting in there, and he
Oh,
was
like
doing
recording them?
he was doing camera surveillance and recording it, and they found all of the VHS tapes that they were using at the time. And so, what, how does that equate with this whole idea of being some great whistleblower at S4
Right,
and
a
all the
noble
rest of it?
whistleblower.
Yeah. I mean, can we get one straight question? And unfortunately, you had Rogan just sitting there going, wow, everything's been proven true. No, like nothing that he has said has actually been proven true. In fact, so much of it is still very ridiculous. Now, it's quite possible that in a low level position somewhere, in like a maintenance crew or something, that he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. I'm perfectly willing to accept that. But this guy has used this for years, and it is absurd, and it's absurd to be celebrated. I mean, is that really what the UFO field is about now? Going back and rehashing this story of this guy who was, found guilty of running this brothel and doing this surveillance and all the rest of it. I mean, it's a sketchy little scene there down Las Vegas way on that. So it's very disappointing. I would also say that, if you go into those records, you're going to find Lazar using the excuse that he was traumatized by the ET stuff for all sorts of things to try to get himself out of legal jeopardy. I mean, this is a guy who's always been talking out of multiple sides of his mouth, and to sit there and just ask him no tough questions like, what about these court cases? What were you actually doing? How'd you get into all this? And then say, why did you make up, your whole history of being over here at MIT? I mean, those are the essential questions you would ask somebody who's making extraordinary claims. But we're going through this thing again where you get the softball type deal, and that's not how you get answers in the UFO field. You ask tough questions. Investigative journalism is adversarial journalism. It's not personal, but you get right in there and ask the right questions. So we got a real problem there. There's no real journalism on the UFO side, and there's just a lot of puffery and a lot of congressmen, making statements and then being like, "Oh, I'm not suicidal." Well, I wouldn't worry about it because, they're feeding you stuff that you're saying, so you're actually doing their bidding. And I've commented on this before. I think the ones that they keep rolling out, like Burchett and Burleson and Luna and stuff, just don't have a clue what they're talking about in relation to the UFO file. So it's very comfortable for the groups that are controlling the secrecy to just roll them out there to say wild things, like, I heard there's a great big UFO hidden somewhere underground, they're not going to tell Congress where any of that stuff is. It's too important, literally that program is important. And the independent media and Congress are, failing the stress test for the real story that's going on here, which is the missing general and scientists associated all with what? This UFO project, as we've put on the record in the past few episodes. So this becomes, I would say, more and more important. And so we'll do a big overview on that, follow-up on all of that, right after we get into this very crucial episode tonight, all about the Sphinx and the Hall of Records. Miss Olivia, before I go any further, what do you got?
Okay, let's start here. Happy Herbert 3D says, might there be a connection between the McCasland UFO scientist disappearances and the Artemis moonshot? And Cognitive Sky says, DJ, did you catch the slip-up reference to General McCasland by Congressman Burchett when he said, quote, people who know about this are being disappeared, unquote?
Well, I'm not impressed with Burchett. I think he reads stuff and then puts himself in the middle of it over and over again, but he's not actually done anything. And he claims, he's getting briefed, or somebody told him about breeding programs in a skiff or something. I mean, this is more of the fluff character. How about having real hearings where you subpoena people, ask them tough questions, and, take it on the level of like a cosmic Watergate, as our friend Stanton Friedman used to say. This other stuff is just all fluff stuff. It's allowing everyone, in fact, to grandstand. And the enemies are all hidden, Well, how about rounding up, say, half dozen of the counterintelligence people who were pitching to the podcasters for the past few years all about a UFO threat, and asking them, who's paying you to talk about a UFO threat? Who's putting that out there because they want a UFO defense office? Those are the types of questions. I don't want to hear Congress people, talking about, oh, there's a huge UFO base under the water, and I'm afraid for my life because I went on Newsmax and talked about it. I mean, this is some dumb stuff. And over and over again, the problem is what is built up as the independent media. It's co-opted in a sense. It's co-opted by the same forces that have created the corporate media, and they've just gone into this other place and masqueraded as independent. But the other problem is there's not a good knowledge base around the UFO file in the field. So you get people just wanting to roll out headlines or slapping some guy in there who's like, oh yeah, I saw a face melting ET, That's not how you do it. What you do is you try to figure out the roots of the government secrecy around where they took the program, one, and then you compare that with the witness testimonies, two, and then three, you try to isolate where the government reinvented aspects of technology and rolled them out while keeping that wall of secrecy in place so they could, exploit the technology on the exotic side in the background. That's the way that you would do it. But yeah, I appreciate the question. I just, unfortunately, they're giving the Congress people a lot of softballs, and pretending it's extraordinary. But a couple of bright signs here. Oh, since you mentioned that, very, very interesting Artemis launch, and we did have the commander of that launch. They were playing this clip where he was saying, "You know what? This is the first time we've gone to the moon." I mean,
Yes.
It's kind of provocative, don't you think?
Actually, I was amazed at how unprofessional and casual they all seemed.
Interesting.
The
Yeah.
whole tone of it.
They're like, this is awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
I know. Give me like, Armstrong or
Yeah,
somebody
exactly.
like that.
Astronauts are supposed to be elite scientists.
Yes. Right. Representatives of a new world, new breed. This is what I found interesting. There's a Canadian astronaut on this trip, and he decided to put into his patch, "The Sasquatch is honesty." Now, I mentioned that they've done some weird things in relation to Sasquatch recently. There's been a huge wave of sightings in Ohio, which are extraordinary. And of course, they're always extraordinary in the Pacific Northwest. If you go up to Oregon, Washington, you're deep in Sasquatch country. Everyone has a story up there. And this has been going on for a long, long time. There's a number of interesting explanations of what it could be that don't fall into any kind of traditional category. But here's this guy. Hansen included indigenous perspectives on his personal message mission patch. And right there at the top, you can see is the Bigfoot under the word Canadian there. This is weird. This is weird stuff. And it's almost like, I'm playing around with UFO disclosure. I'm playing around with Bigfoot disclosure. I'm playing around with Atlantis disclosure. And they are doing a lot of data mining, I think, in relation to this. The other thing is that there's a big, debunking movie that's come out, and they've started to do coverage of this guy who put out this, I'm debunking Bigfoot now. And like Wall Street Journal and all these other people are covering this, which seems like an odd topic for them to cover, quite frankly. It's not their wheelhouse by a long, long shot. I do want to say that, one of the things that's important that is going on here. Oh, and I want to mention this, which is that Gigi Young did a show today, and she talked a lot about how they're using, just like I've been talking about this. She really put this out, and this is important. The combining UFOs with demons thing is such a canard, as it were, and it's such a manipulative move to get us, to manipulate the Christian community and to be like, oh, you're fighting demons up there, give us the trillions of dollars and we'll get rid of that nasty UFO threat. But when we're done with the show today, I want everyone to check this out because Gigi did a fantastic job on that, just excellent. And this is exactly what we're talking about, and it has to be hit off at the pass. It has to be gotten to now, because by the time the summer rolls around and they're really pegging this in, you're going to have, Luna and JD Vance. You get the vice president of the United States saying that UFOs are demons. Are you kidding me? And just put up. Everyone should just put up a picture of a UFO in their relative social media and just write, "Hey, JD Vance, look, a demon." This is ridiculous. We have so many reports from qualified pilots. So many reports from astronauts, so many reports from very reliable witnesses on the ground that what they're seeing are craft, and some of those craft can maneuver like our craft and go far, far beyond what we're doing. And sometimes they imitate our craft and all the rest. And the idea that there's some demon at the controls is absolutely absurd. And so, this is what I was getting to with Alex. One of the things that he was putting across was I was trying to point out to him that we've been so, in his work, he was so advanced as he was so ahead of the curve on 9/11, so ahead of the curve on COVID, so ahead of the curve on the financial coup d'etat and things like that. And it's that type of approach that we need. Just like our work has been ahead on the UFO threat, and everything that we said in the outline of what they were doing, they ended up doing it exactly. And we exposed their counterintelligence agents that were working the field while everyone else was praising them and saying, "We're getting the truth, bro," and all the rest. So this is a real, if you want to get to the truth on this, it's a whole different matter than if you want to have this kind of entertainment vibe to it. Now it's too crucial. This is the thing. The period of time that we're in, it's too crucial to get it wrong. And, waiting around and unfurling it, if we put out all this stuff about TTSA and Elizondo and all the rest of it, 2018, 2019, it took 6 years for that space to catch up with the fact that, it's a bunch of counterintelligence, CIA, DIA, NRO, NGA officers doing this. So they're all under the same control, as it were. It's too long. The gap is too long for when we're putting the message out. And they're getting everyone confused and in this whirlwind, and going after characters, like, Bride of Chucky or whatever, and spending tons of money. And those are TV producers. I've looked into that and I've put it across for everyone. You got 14 TV producers running this thing. And they know how to do it. They're the same people who ran the Lost show and others. They know how to make money, and they know about cliffhangers and all the rest. So we need to really separate the potent work of getting to the root of these things versus, the fluff matter and the washer machine of this stuff that's supposed to make you kind of click and get outraged, or click and fall into some ridiculous TV series massaged track around this, which has nothing to do with independent media at all. And they're trying to get our attention far, far away from where the ball needs to be. But there's a reason for that. And the archaeology wars are certainly a part of it. We're going to get into all of it tonight. Everyone, this is a very special Dark Journalist episode. It is X Series 221. And it's the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records Pyramid X breakthrough. Now, we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. We're just going to go about 2 hours with you here tonight on this special Saturday edition. We usually do Friday nights, but Saturday's fun too, right? It's rowdy. It's a little rowdier.
It's definitely rowdier.
We know this from experience.
I have a really great question
Yeah.
that's off topic for tonight, but I want to ask it right now.
Sure.
Ryan Mooney says, DJ, on Alex Jones, you said the cloners could not clone the silver cord. What did you mean by that statement?
Well, there's this whole idea that you can clone. This comes into the show tonight because of what Cayce was talking about with the automatons and what the Atlantean scientists were doing with these automatons, which are basically clones that they were using as slaves. Now, when you get into our period, the reemergence of the science paradigm, cloning comes in almost immediately. And what they're trying to pretend now is that they can create clones. So they've been talking, well, we're making these body parts using a human body, and they are also going to do it, raise the organs without the head. Is also very, very suspicious. And nobody, nobody voted on this. I can tell you that. What are the ethics involved there? It's a Japanese company doing that. But when you look at that, and then you look at what they're doing with the robot thing, they're moving this idea that they can create a human. They'll be like, it'll be great for interrelation with AI and all that. We'll have a half human, half cyborg machine. And the cloning that they want to do, there's this whole idea among the elites, and Musk and other people have talked about this, where they're saying, oh, I can project my consciousness into this little cube and dump off my avatar on Mars or whatever. Anyone who studies on the mystery school side or just study anatomy also, the silver cord is something that goes back in history. It's well known that your pituitary, your pineal, and the Leydig glands constitute that silver cord. That's how you get spiritual consciousness in a physical body. So you can't just remove that process, and sort of create these artificial physical support system. And there's not going to be a soul. It's going to be a soulless entity, half cyborg, half human. This is exactly what they did in Atlantis. That caused a lot of problems, according to the Cayce readings. And part of the problem is it's a soul trapping kind of thing, because a soul can't inhabit it. There's no possibility for spiritual potential or whatever if these things aren't part of the natural flow, of things. There's no way to make a half machine, half human hybrid and then have a soul as a result, unless you want to just create this sort of Frankenstein experiment on a spiritual, psychospiritual, physical level. And they're trying to roll this out and make it sound normal. And one of the things they had the First Lady doing with one of these humanoid robots is recommending it as a better teacher, and it'll be more patient with your children. So instead of doing events with, teachers who are working hard to teach kids and let's, lift them up, they're from hardworking families and everything else, you're rolling out these robots and saying, hey, check it out, this robot PLATEAU, it's going to be better and more patient for your kids. That whole thing is a denial of, instead of improving the human being, you're going for the robots, and what does that make you? It makes you anti-human, in fact. So this is the whole wave that we're in, but we're only seeing the rim, the very kind of periphery of the whole thing. Just wait, on their side, they've dived in dramatically, and just wait until we see what they've really created, including, you heard about drone armies. Well, how about clone armies? So we're talking Star Wars 101 here, and on steroids. It's getting into that type of situation, which is why I think a big wake-up call in 2026 would be so well timed, and we have the material to do it. And strangely enough, we have the mystery background feeding into this, the esoteric information which was put there for us to discover and to use. That's what's so important. And that's why it stands out, I think, so dramatically against a lot of trends and things that come and go. But the mystery school information, Steiner's work, anthroposophy, Cayce's work, the work of Theosophy, Gurdjieff, it's there. It's a kind of a bulwark. It's a defense against this thing that's coming in. And I think it gives us a lot of answers. Some of those answers are found way, way in the past. And that's where we're going to head off to tonight. Miss Olivia, what else you got?
Emerald Eyes Lioness said, what does DJ think about the talk of hybrids amongst us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I talked about this with Alex, and, I've done a number of shows with David Jacobs, and he is the tenured professor there at Temple University in Philadelphia. And he's been on this track since the 1970s. He was a colleague of John Mack and Bud Hopkins, and those guys who are really onto the track of the abductee and this whole part of things. And I would say this about him, his work is absolutely stellar. When I sat down with him on a few occasions, he told me totally straight-faced that he felt not only were there already alien human hybrids among us, but he felt that he had been sort of the target of a group of these for talking about it for so many years. And as somebody who people would listen to, being a professor at Temple University, the guy's written some amazing books, and his experiences and the things he's told me about it, I think are worth looking into on a deep level, no matter how you look at it. But there's no question in those cases, there's DNA manipulation in all the abduction cases. It seems like it's all on the alien side. And when you get these beings that are, scraping skin, taking sperm samples and all the things that they do, those are definitely genetic science experiments. And very often, from the people's recollections, there seems to be some carryover with a genetic program to create hybrid offspring. This has come up in too many cases for it to be ignored. That's why it became something of a theme for a while. And then it's, like the abduction experience, it's gone very deep underground. You don't hear too many people talking about it. And yet you can't imagine that the experiences have stopped altogether on that level. So I think it's very worthwhile subject to look into. And we've spent a lot of time on it. You have to go with the right people. And again, no CIA people, no counterintelligence people. Just keep them off. They can go off on their own weird, they can create the CIA show and have all the CIA people talk up their ridiculous points about being abductees as people like Semivan and stuff. This is the interesting tip off for me about TTSA when they came out, which is they spent, all of this time and money assembling the best CIA crew for that rollout they could get their hands on. And they had Semivan, who was a 25-year member of the directorate of the CIA. That's the top, very top level. It's kind of the kind of guy that you just don't find out about. And they made him the COO of the company. So he was somebody who said, you know what? I had an alien experience. I'm an abductee myself. And then remember they were rolling out this other guy. What was his name? Ramirez, John Ramirez. This guy was also a high-level CIA officer. And he was coming out and saying, I got abducted. And so now not only were they having these people who were saying, well, the whistleblowers are all CIA people, but now the abductees were all CIA people. So that keeps it all in this nice, like, here's the respected authority on this. And you're going to always get intelligence people. That's by design. And always with intelligence operations, they see how far they can push it, how far they can get. And so, we've put it on the record as much as we can. And, if there's somebody genuinely defecting from the CIA who's a whistleblower, of course, I would listen to what they had to say. But over and over again, these people we find never get asked the tough questions. And one of the main question with all that is, do you still work for the government? Because if they still work for the government, then they're still under, all their security oaths and everything else. So therefore, those are the people I would put dead last on a list like that, because you're not going to get the truth that way. And it was interesting to me. I want to put this on the record at the Lazar thing. Lazar was out there saying, well, I don't make any money from this. All the money for the movie I did with Corbell, I didn't see a cent or whatever. Let me tell you something. Bob Lazar got $2 million from Bob Bigelow as soon as his story came out. And in the early 90s, Bigelow made a huge deal with him. $2 million, that's kickoff money. That's for starters. We have no idea how much money this guy has made. And so let's be real. Let's get real here and stop with the softball conversations and the like, oh, hey, man, I'm smoking a blunt with Bob Lazar and he's telling me about UFOs, That's bull. That's not journalism. That's a joke. And so let's get real and get to the real story of the UFO file while there's still a good window of opportunity before they've pulled off the UFO sky event threat, as it were. And that's where I think the independent media can really put the focus and really do this. And the thing is, this whole, putting Hollywood money behind these intelligence dangles, this is a bad process. And they moved those people over. Their reward is all this Hollywood stuff. So that's why you have, the Day of Disclosure movie, you had all the Elizondo, Grush, Millen, all those people are all involved in those movies. Well, this is because they ran it through the podcast thing and there was no resistance. Practically the only resistance was this show, and then 3 or 4 years later, people caught on. And we were very often a lone outpost, I can tell you that. And sometimes people would write to me and be like, oh, Chris Millen, he's done so much for disclosure work and stuff. And I would write back and show them his tweet saying, well, I let this guy talk to dark journalist. I wouldn't let this guy talk to dark journalist. That's his own stuff in his own bio. I mean, these are his own social media presence. This is a guy who was the mayor of Area 51. So are we communicating? There's reality track and then there's fluff land, UFO, CIA, threat land. So there are two different places to be. I can tell you for sure, even if we're a lone outpost on this, with our super friends, you know, you're getting the real track here on that. And the real track is there's a lot of money behind exercises in Hollywood from the Spielberg side. And, Clapper was in the Spielberg documentary, The Age of Disclosure, and all of that. That's Spielberg's producer that directed that, Dan Farrow. So this is it's all CIA everywhere you look, and I mean, the government is crazy with this, anyone who does even that much research is going to find that, but they don't care, and obviously they think, well, the public doesn't care either. And certainly the people who are running the podcasts and things don't care because that's not a real potent independent media. Well, we certainly can be. And we're going to find that out through the efforts of this show and our super friends. Everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's X Series 221, the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records Pyramid Breakthrough. And like I said, we just did the Alex Jones show yesterday, a tremendous response from putting these things on the record. And I do salute people like Alex and the media who have the bravery to bring up the deep, potent topics. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Okay. Okay. I want to go back to Sasquatch. Deep State Your Fire says, DJ, can the Sami project themselves as Sasquatch? And Amarillo Gunrunner says, do the automatons have anything to do with Bigfoot?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The first question is based around the fact that the thing we put on the record, we did a lot of talking about the Men in Black. And what I've put on the record when I've done shows about the Men in Black, which are real groups, but they seem to have mystical abilities. They disappear, they reappear, they can psychically attack people. It's not just some government people showing up after the fact and interrogating witnesses. That does happen, of course, but these other experiences go even further than that. And Alex was telling me about his own experience with a Men in Black character in 2016 in Washington, D.C., and it had all the hallmarks of that kind of, terror by intimidation thing that they are well known to do with a kind of astral projection trick of like basically throwing dark energy. Now, when you look at a character like Dan Aykroyd, you might think, this guy's a comedian, whatever, but he has an interest in the UFO file. Well, he was doing a show for the Sci-Fi Channel, and he had actually taped a bunch of episodes, but they got around to something relating to the Men in Black. And then he, was downstairs taking a break at the studios in New York City. And it's weird. He said he was talking to Britney Spears on the phone. Mm-hmm. This story is off the charts. And he's totally straight-faced with this. Like, this is not a put on. And he said he looked over, and he was like setting up an SNL thing or something. He looks over and he sees classic Men in Black, but like in 1940s clothes with a brand new car, but it's a 1940s car. And they're looking at him and he feels that same thing. It was just like what Alex Jones was telling me about his experience in 2016. There was a menacing feeling to it. And then he looked around and he looked back and they were completely gone, like they had blinked in and blinked out. He goes back up and 2 hours later, he gets a call that his show has been canceled and none of the shows that they have filmed are going to be shown, but they're still going to pay him off for the money that they decided just to, not do this whole show. That's Aykroyd's story. I think there are more cases like this in celebrity circles than we've heard about. And I think there's a very interesting track in relation to this. But what I found out about the Men in Black is there was a fantastic researcher named John Keel whose work inspired me. I've been reading his stuff since I was like 7 or 8 years old. And I read The Eighth Tower at 7 years old, I think. And but I found Keel instantly engaging, and he was always hardcore with the facts, and he wasn't making things up. And he would always go and talk to the witnesses and show up and identify himself. And some of his stories about as soon as he would go and interview some of the witnesses for these UFO cases, what would happen is the people that he was going to talk to were like, oh yeah, your secretary and your assistant were here yesterday. And he said, I don't have a secretary and assistant. And they said, oh, they got all the facts from us. So there were these people imitating him and what he was doing. And he was getting these strange calls while he was investigating these cases, these UFO cases, particularly in West Virginia that became the Mothman cases. And they would call him with this kind of electronic voice and give him details of what was going to happen in his day tomorrow, and traffic jams and snafus and who was going to call him. Like they would knew everything that was going to go down. And he thought, well, that's very strange. So he got very interested in this Men in Black thing. And he starts going to the people who had the Men in Black experiences. And a number of them say, well, over and over again, they're giving this description. They're like, very short, it's like 5 feet tall, something like that. And the features were always Asian. That's what he could tell, that people were always saying that. But he wanted to know, he wanted to really nail it down. So what he did was he took pictures of, examples of all these different types of, Europeans, Hawaiians, Asians, whatever it was. He just rolled them all in there. And he said that there was one picture that everyone stopped on, and they unanimously, it wasn't 10% or 20% or 30% who chose this picture. It was 100%. And the picture was of this Sami woman. And Samis over in Sweden, in Finland, they're an indigenous group there, and they are renowned for their shaman activity and tremendous psychic powers. So, it's quite interesting, in fact, when you look at that history even a little bit. And some of the people that we might know who are Sami are like Renee Zellweger, and that they have an exotic, beautiful, like magnetic appearance. And the original term that was used for them was Laplander. And I guess that term that's like a derogatory term now. But they're just the Sami people, and they've been this indigenous group throughout that region. And I went into the stories and found tremendous, tremendous stories about the legends of them and how they astral projected and how they terrified these other invading groups and tribes and things over the years. And that, even the Tsar in Russia wanted to get his hands on them. And so the weirdest thing was, when I went back into their history sufficiently enough, I found that they had been recruited in large scale and immigrated here to America in 1911 and 1912. And there was a huge wave of them who were brought over here. And ostensibly, the reason was, to train reindeer or something like this, which I
cover story.
I was like, this is pretty good. By the time you get to the stories about the Men in Black in the late 40s harassing the UFO witnesses, it's very clear that these are not just people under ordinary circumstances acting weird. There's something odd about them, including the fact that they can, as I said, do supernatural activity, like disappear. And also, it's sort of like voice to skull technology. They can talk in people's heads and stuff, but long before this was widely known. Well, the Sami, in fact, have this incredible ability to astral project and all the rest of it. And what I ended up terming this aspect of the Men in Black activity for the CIA was the astral agency. They had trained people up to that point so well. And if you think that's too far out, we already know the CIA was engaged in major psychic investigations, the remote viewing program, and others. So this is just part of what they would do. But it makes the most sense. And the fact that we have Keel and the witnesses giving us that hint that these people, there's no reason why they would look like Sami people unless, they were Sami. So this I find very, very fascinating. And that I think opens up the question there about what you were saying. In terms of the Sasquatch thing and the automatons, it's quite interesting because I've told people this story before about meeting with the Transcenders, this guy who was in Canada. And it's a very fascinating story because I wasn't doing dark journalist publicly yet. I was working for a tech magazine, as I was the editor of a tech magazine, and they this prediction came over. It was like a press release, and it was put out in September of 2010. And the prediction was there are going to be UFOs hovering over New York City on October 13th. And it was put out by an ex-NORAD officer, this guy up in Canada, Stan Fulham. So I thought, this is interesting. And I kept an eye on it. And then, boom, it happened. Daytime sighting, massive wave of UFOs sitting over New York City. You can still find reports on it. If you search, New York City, October 13th, 2010, you're going to find this whole thing. And this was in relation to the idea that the UFOs and the groups out there, they were going to do their own kind of disclosure moment to let us know they were there and all the rest. And so when this went down, I thought I have to talk to this guy, and I got in touch with him, and he said, "I'm doing all these shows, but we'll talk in a few weeks." Now, he was an elderly gentleman, but he passed away in 3 weeks from the time that the prediction came true. Well, I learned subsequently that the person who had given him the prediction was an Edgar Cayce style figure that was operating up there in Canada. So I decided I'd like to spend a lot of time with this person. And I taped about 12 hours of conversation and readings from this psychic source called the Transcenders. And Rick Thurston was the psychic. Absolutely fascinating experience. And what I can tell you is, in his own, in some other reading somewhere, he mentioned the fact that the Sasquatch was some kind of disappearing link, and he had been created by the Atlanteans originally, and they, at a certain point when Atlantis went down, what was left of the automatons, he was one of the automatons that was left over. So your instincts, your intuition was right on. Whether it's true or not, I have no idea, but quite fascinating indeed that there was a lot of, much more scientific engineering going on back there. So when we hear stories about Anunnaki making slaves and things, or the Watchers coming down and producing giants by sleeping with human women, Elohim and all these other aspects, there's some factor of an other quality interacting with the line. And that gets us directly to the Cayce work. So that's going to maybe open the question up even more. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 221. Are you ready for the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records? Wow. Well, we had so much to catch up on there, and we'll do more. As I said, we're going to do a show on the missing generals again next week, and we'll also get Gigi Young on stat.
On that Gigi note?
Yes.
DTM190 said, I was listening to an X Series show with Gigi from, I believe, 6 or 7 years ago, and you were discussing Gigi's vision of the second Sphinx.
Yes. Oh, yes, that's true. And I remember the episode that you're talking about. I'll go back and listen to that. I want to tell you over and over again, when it comes to Gigi, she has pinpointed things that were so out of space and time. And then later, a couple of years, sometimes you will realize everything that she was talking about became, just opened up dramatically. And one of the incredible things that we did that kind of kicked off all the work that we do together, and she's been so helpful in the background around this show. But one of the things we had was about the 3 hairs symbology and how this went back. And it's that show, the level of that show, I think that's the show where what you're talking about in relation to this Sphinx. But there have been hints about a second Sphinx, and what they've been focusing on lately for headlines is the dream stela that's in front of the Sphinx. It shows the Sphinx on this side and the Sphinx on that side. There were I found very early archaeology work suggesting that somebody thought when they were clearing away the Sphinx, because remember, the Sphinx has only been cleared since like 1920. The head has been visible, but the body has not been there. We haven't gotten all of that. They really made a process of that over years. So the Sphinx comes back into our consciousness in this period, again, when the Atlanteans are reincarnating, perhaps, and we get the world wars. And suddenly the Egyptian thing is coming back into our consciousness. The King Tut's tomb gets discovered in 1922, and it's the only intact tomb that we've ever run across. So there's a number of moves in relation to how we were to understand ancient Egypt in this period of time that we've only had it, really, the big answers on a number of these things for like 100 years. So as soon as that was starting to rise in consciousness, people like Rudolf Steiner, people like Edgar Cayce were giving us the clues and the handle around what the, structures were all about, what the esoteric backdrop was, and how it informs our culture, how it's part of a prophecy and an opening up of our culture at this point. So The Sphinx in particular, something extraordinary that Cayce did is he talked about these halls of records. And the halls of records are actually pyramids, and they're underground. There's one there, and he also said that there's three. They contain the exact same information, but the Atlanteans decided, you know what? One in Egypt, one off of Bimini, and one in Yucatan. And the one that was off Bimini sank. It's down there, and that's the Bimini Wall. That's what's been rising. The one in Yucatan has not been found, but indications about where it is and some of the artifacts around it have been found. And Cayce gave us instructions about that. And in fact, when I went into that history, I did a series of episodes called Pawgate, which was all about how they used the paw symbolism for these different sphinxes. And that's all part of the same brotherhood, the group's secret society working back the mystery schools in the Atlantean period. So when the egress happens, when the final meltdown takes place in Atlantis, and that's not just earthquakes by natural causes, that is the TUAOI stone power grid taking the entire place down, according to Cayce's work, because it was accidentally set too high. So think about how we have, kind of nuclear meltdowns and things of this nature. Well, if you had this type of power source and it ran into that type of trouble where it was pulling and causing inundations and setting off volcanoes and all this stuff, it gets so bad that everyone takes off and goes to the Pyrenees, they go to Egypt, they go to Spain, or they go to South America, or they go to Mexico and America, stretching over to Nevada and other places. So this is Cayce's story of what took place at the end of Atlantis. So when we think about it that way, we can kind of understand that a group of initiates who were leading the spiritual community in Atlantis decided, how are we going to tell humanity about this? How are we going to preserve this? Because the memory of this is going to go down, because we've gone from this high-tech society to nothing, basically. And so they decide to create an entire initiatory process around the records and where they're stored. And the fact that two of those locations are in the hot zone, I think, makes a major emphasis for that area around the Bahamas, Yucatan, and Cuba, Bimini, the whole place there. So we're getting really signs that there's something about where the core areas are. The other thing about Giza and the whole piece around Egypt, they asked Cayce at one point, why did they select Egypt? And he said there were a couple of reasons. One was that it's the center of all universal activity. I found that interesting. But two, he also said, well, and remember, he's dating at 10,500 BC. Traditionally, it's dated 2,500 BC, 2,400 BC. So he's got 8,000 years to account for. And he says, well, these people actually, one of the reasons they chose it was that's where the original temple of Isis stood before the deluge. So that whole area goes underwater, then it comes back up, and then these people like Ratta and Hermes and others go and look for a space where they can create, the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx to guard the records. So they're already doing archaeology on their side in 10,500 BC. How old is the Giza Plateau when we think of it that way? So, we have to get our heads in the mindset that we don't have a clear picture of history, and the idea of, civilization 6,000 years ago getting kicked off in Samaria or whatever isn't going to cut it. We're in a different zone now, and we need to understand what it was. And that's where I think this information comes in the most. I'll get you one more question, and I'll dive into this.
Kontiki Man wanted to know what agency would be involved in that pre-CIA or other three-letter agencies when we're talking about when the Sami first came.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a very early version. It could be, you've got things where Blavatsky and people like that are telling us the mystery groups are deeply embedded in the political process to the point where 80 or 90% of what takes place is all dependent on these secret societies. So those societies acting through the government, you did have the move for things like World War I. You did have the things for moves like the Federal Reserve, the income tax. And you've got the passing of the baton there from Taft, who was very corrupt, so corrupt that he was actually, he was formerly the VP of Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was so disgusted with him because Roosevelt did his terms and he got out. And then his VP took over and he gave all the money to the fat cats. And Roosevelt said, forget it. I'm going to run against you. But I can't do it as a Republican. I'll do it independently. And he created a whole bull moose ticket to take him on. And that's how Wilson got in this very tight, slim corridor. He just barely got in against these two guys because, it's like the big split of the vote. Very similar to what they did with Clinton and Perot versus Bush, because when they got Clinton in, he didn't actually have a great voter base. It's not well remembered, but he barely got in with 40% of the vote. That's very, very low. Most people lose with that kind of thing. But Perot came in with 20% of the vote as an independent, spent $60 million of his own money on it, and was a very mysterious character in his own right. But one of the things that Perot did was he shook up that entire thing, very much like Roosevelt had done in the 1912 election. Now, I want to say this because people give Woodrow Wilson a tremendous hard time. And this is interesting because there are occasionally splits in how the mystery schools view things. So in the Cayce readings, there's a cousin of Wilson who gets in touch with Cayce and has Cayce do a series of readings first on the health of Wilson and give him the very important 14 points for establishing a League of Nations. Well, this is very interesting because he claims that when they're doing the peace talks at the end of World War I, that what they do is they punish Germany so harshly that the readings warn that if they hold that punishment in place, the Germans will come back and basically cause World War II, which is exactly what happened. And he said that the person who was standing up and was actually channeling a Christ-like energy was Wilson. And they said, people in looking at that said, well, Wilson doesn't even, he was a Princeton dean. He doesn't even have like a religious background. And Cayce addressed it. And he said, people don't even expect this guy to be religious, but here he was, getting this incredible energy to try to take people on and say, we need to establish a family of nations so that we don't go to war like this. Well, it didn't happen. Of course, we didn't adopt it. And then a corrupt version came up later of the United Nations, which again, in theory, yeah, it would be a tremendous idea. But unfortunately, they get in there and everybody manipulates everybody. And, when they have like oil for food programs and then everybody's getting paid off in the background, that's what the UN has turned into. That's why you have kind of the mess that we're seeing in the world right now. And what we're looking at, I think, with the invasion of Iran and all the rest of it is because there isn't a functioning setup for any of this. Like the nations don't talk to each other on that level. It's all controlled by, groups that get their hands on the machinery and, basically are subservient to a deep state aspect. What's interesting, I will say this, and then we'll jump into the Hall of Records. I will say this about the deep state in relation to this. They have done a very good job of taking themselves off of the radar. You don't hear people talking as much about the deep state. They're always, going after Iran. We see all this stuff where, it's kind of like you can choose your nation state to go after. China's the big one. And of course, we have incredible foreign policy liability, which is Israel, causing, a lot of this mayhem going on in the Middle East. There's no question about it. And dragging us along. Well, it's very interesting because the deep state has done a good job navigating the lack of education in the independent media or the intentional lack of focus in the independent media and getting it all off of all the research around the deep state, which was the idea was it's a central group operating through, as Peter Dale Scott told us, the Central Intelligence Agency on one hand, the financial, those who are controlling financial systems, central banking model, and the contractor groups around the intelligence agencies, including Booz Allen Hamilton and things of this nature, who operate more outside of the purview of law even than the CIA or the NSA, because after all, they're just contractor groups. And the worst that can happen to them is they get found out and they have to fold, right? Well, all of these different things form a deep state, and that's how things get done in the world using these power systems. Well, somehow in the past sort of 3 or 4 years, that has gotten glossed over, and you just have these figures out there going crazy on one subject or one figure, you know, as I've pointed out earlier today. So we have to be very careful that all the things that have been established by great researchers like Peter Dale Scott, Jim Mars, Paris Lamond, and others, all the great research that they've poured in here, and it doesn't have anything to do with any nation state. It is the deep state. After all, it's the whole point that they're not beholden to any one particular place. This is crucial. So that's how we stay on track, I would say, in relation to that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch around the remarkable censorship. And it'll let you know about the exciting shows that we have coming up for you, interviews that will blow your mind, mini-series. Right now we're doing a follow-up to the Pyramid X mini-series. Of course, we have JFK and the UFO file, and The Craze in the Hot Zone, which is all about Atlantis, and everything that goes down right there in the hot zone near the Bahamas. Now, basically what you do is you get once a week, you'll get an update on all that. And so go to darkjournalist.com, sign up, stand up and be counted, and make sure that you're on that list. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Wolfgang McCarthy says, we can't see the Epstein list, so do you think they'll ever let us see the Hall of Records?
Right. Woo, yeah. Well, somebody said, boy, you know, they pulled a war and UFO disclosure off over the rest of the Epstein files. But yeah, I think there's a lot, you know, they hung on to the JFK records for 60 some odd years, and they still never gave out the forces that were behind the assassination. So records don't necessarily tell you what you want to hear anyway. The investigations of the connections certainly get you close. I want to go into the environment of late 20s, and Cayce giving these readings, and what had happened around the idea of Atlantis, how it even got back on the map, as it were, because after all, Plato had brought it up in 400, 500 BC and said, you know, it's very interesting, but the priests, Sais, they were telling me, I was hearing all these things about this culture back, you know, Athens, when they had to fight off this culture that had come in, and they were the fleeing Atlanteans. And then he writes these dialogues, Timaeus, and this whole follow-up around what took place and how the Atlanteans, kind of like a Tower of Babel story, they had gotten up to a certain level and then they angered the gods. But before that, they were the most benevolent society. They were the richest society. Something terrible had taken place. And this group that had come over and tried to take on Athens in that period, the priests had told Solon, this relative of Plato's, that, yeah, you know, in fact, you guys fought them off, but this was 9,000 years ago. So basically around 9,500 BC. And if you interpret that, you really look back on that, there's an interesting corollary instantly, because he's going way back in time, but he's putting it on the record. And what they did when they looked at this from a Western education perspective, just like they did with Troy, although they found later on that Troy was real because they discovered it. But what they decided to do with Atlantis was they said, oh, this is a fable. This is something where, you know, Plato's just making this up, and he wants to kind of teach the Athenians to be good, or else the gods will get them, kind of thing. But he was very straight about it. He said, no, and you know, this is absolutely real. And it's interesting because later you have another historian 100 years down the line who's also Greek, who also refers to that story and doesn't think of it as a fable at all. He's referring to it as straight history. So you go on through time, and this kind of echoes along as we go. And then suddenly, around the early 16th century, you get the incredible New Atlantis. And Francis Bacon puts this out there and talks about basically how America is this New Atlantis. And there's a hint there when he puts it out on July 4th that he knows what's coming. And in fact, they held up on the Declaration of Independence until July 4th to keep it aligned with this kind of Bacon prophecy back there. So it was starting to emerge in these different cycles about a lost land and all the rest of it. When you get to Helena Blavatsky in 1875 coming out with the Theosophical teaching of Isis Unveiled and things of this nature, she's really saying there's a whole culture back there. It was inundated, and our culture, it was basically spawned. Our current culture comes from this lost continent. And it's interesting. Blavatsky is a very, very unusual figure back in history. She was Russian, and as a female traveling the world, she was searching for these mystery schools. This master found her. She had a very colorful background. She spent all this time performing in Egypt. Musically performing. I don't hear much about that. And it's a very colorful and also covered up past, I think, with her. But essentially, she lands in New York in 1875. And there's somebody who is a colonel, a retired colonel, who's writing articles now, and he's obsessed with spiritualism. His name is Colonel Alcott. And this is a guy who had such a reputation that they put him on the kind of Warren Commission of the period looking into Abe Lincoln's assassination. And he had focused on all these things that were going on at the Eddy household up in Vermont, which were absolutely fascinating, where people were seeing these live projection shows of these ghosts and, deceased relatives and things. And he's writing about it, and he goes there and he's writing more about it. She's reading the articles. She decides, I'm going to go up there and meet him. And he describes the whole meeting, but it seems like somebody's putting them together on the outside. They formed the Theosophical Society with Emma Britton. And Emma Britton is this incredible psychic medium from the UK who was used as a young girl from 11 to 13 as this medium for this group called the Orphic Circle. And that's an extraordinary story in itself. I've done some episodes on Emma, but I think there's more to be uncovered there. So they decide we're going to basically do this gigantic breakthrough of bringing this information out. And Isis Unveiled is the book that is the result of all this. And it is extraordinary. There's never been anything like that. It is an absolute bombshell. Where did this information come from? How did this woman know it? How does she know all about the evolution of humanity, the spiritual forces that are involved, the lost continents, etc.? And it's interesting because right around there, you have Atlantis, the antediluvian world, coming up, and it's Ignatius Donnelly, and he's out there and he's giving us this information. Donnelly is a politician out of Minnesota, and he writes this incredible book about Atlantis, and he goes into how the different naming things that are going on in Egypt and other places and in the Mediterranean have all this similarity, all these naming things that these native tribes had done in Central America and all the rest. And he envisions this land bridge, and he goes deep into a whole story about Atlantis. Well, now we're really starting to roll at that point. Atlantis gains a lot of ground, and it's a foundation of the Theosophical Society. You get Steiner joining the Theosophical Society and running the branches in Germany, and then he goes his own way. And Steiner's an extraordinary personality on a number of levels. Austrian mystic, genius, he created biodynamic farming, anthroposophy, the Waldorf schools, you name it. This guy was having such a societal impact, but he was an extraordinary mystic in his own right. And what he starts to realize is Egyptian and Atlantis history becomes crucial to this period because we're basically recapitulating it. We're coming back and facing off against it. It's one of these epochs that is repeating And he starts to say extraordinary things about this, including the fact that so many Atlanteans will be reincarnating at some point in the future that there'll be a group of scientists inside the government that will be studying their unconscious, subconscious memories about those previous lives to get to these new discoveries in science, in medicine and in technology. So Steiner starts to project this entire worldview in relation to Atlantis and all the terrible things that went down there, and the fact that it was destroyed from the inside by this battle that was taking place between these groups. Now, he had more to say about it, but what happens is Cayce's work starts to come up around 1910, around 1915. And Cayce is someone who discovers this incredible ability to go into trance and diagnose people. He has these incredible psychic flashes of the future and so many things. But over and over again, this kind of psychic diagnostic work that he's doing it's so phenomenal because he can lie there in trance and diagnose somebody who is many states away and give them an exact diagnosis of their physical body. This process becomes something more than just medical. And at a certain point, there's a gentleman named Arthur Lammers who's an astrologer, and he wants to know more than just about his health. And he starts to ask him, what does my chart mean? And what does all this mean? And all the rest of it. And Cayce's looking at all of his stuff, and he says, well, many of the impulses that you have in this life are from your other life when you were living as a monk. So he introduces reincarnation right in the heart of this. Now, this is such an earthquake because Cayce is a Sunday school teacher, and he's in Kentucky and Ohio, Alabama and Virginia. I mean, these are very conservative places at the time. So over and over again, they're throwing him out of these churches in a very unfair fashion. And his life is filled with difficulties, but he keeps on with the psychic work. And he will end up doing 900 some odd readings over a 40-year period on the continent of Atlantis. So 900.
Wow.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. So Cayce, anyone who's around him talks about his prophetic gift, his ability as a telepath. They also say that when he was, doing things like playing cards, it was a joke to him because he knew what everyone had in their hands. He just had an extraordinary natural psychic ability and had learned one of the extraordinary, I think, stories from his childhood is, unfortunately, his father beat him when he was a bad student as a 7-year-old boy. And according to his own account, he hears a voice that says, if you sleep on your books, we can help you. And he does it. And he sleeps on the books. And then, the father comes back and all the schoolwork is done. Suddenly his schoolwork is fine. And he keeps that as a process for the rest of his life. Any book, and he would work in bookstores and places, any book that would come into his contact, he could put the contents of the book, the actual book, to his head and know the contents that were inside the book. So there's some kind of extraordinary energy that's dancing off Cayce, and I still don't think we understand the level of that type of psychic interaction that he had. Whenever I go back, as I have been over the past few days, looking at his readings, which are all stored at the Cayce Foundation there in Virginia Beach, but if you're a member, you can get them online and go through them. And I highly recommend it. It's one of the most worthwhile things you can do. But you can get the books too, which really are related by subject. It might be a better way to go. But it is extraordinary, the field of information that he is dealing with. He's dealing with retrocognitive activity. He's dealing with the past. He's dealing with the Civil War. He's dealing with the future. He's dealing with medicine. It is beyond belief what he could do, what he was capable of. But what he does with that picture of Atlantis is it gives us something that even Theosophy and Anthroposophy, although they set the stage, don't really give us the full details the way that Cayce does. What Cayce tells us is the Atlanteans were technologically advanced. And he starts going into technologies that don't exist in the 1920s. And he starts to talk about how they were using them. And some of those technologies don't even exist today. But the Atlanteans were so advanced. And they had flight, of course. They had central power stations. They had control grids based on crystals, and they ran the world, in fact, with this network. Problem is, there were two groups inside there that had been fighting for thousands of years. One of the groups is called the Belial group, and they were kind of a might is right group that believed the technology was for taking what they wanted. And then there's the Amelius group. And the Amelius group is using the same exact technology to interact with the spiritual realm, to basically contact, in Cayce's words, the realm of the saints. So they're channeling this, and they actually have a long history of producing priestesses who can do this and have this interaction. And then there's all these initiates who are oracles for this. Now, a lot of the initiations and a lot of the mystery school information that we'll get later through everything from the Egyptian mystery schools, Pythagoras and the Knights Templar and all that stuff, it all is rooted back in that original experience in Atlantis. This is the crucial thing, and it's kind of the missing link in history. I'm going to show how Cayce gives us that vision of Atlantis and how it leads directly to the development of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid in 10,500 BC, which he had laid down as early as 1926. And here we are, some 100 years later, discovering he was absolutely right. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 221, the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records Pyramid Breakthrough. I'm going to show you what that breakthrough is as well, that the Hall of Records is a pyramid after all. This is how Cayce describes it. It's not just some, long hall or hidden room or whatever. It is another pyramid that's buried under the sands there at Giza. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. Before I go any further, what do you got?
Deep State Your Fire, DJ, do you think humanity is ready for the truth of the Hall of Records? What if the X-Protect/intelligence goons get a hold of the technology, like building a TUAOI crystal system, or maybe they already have?
I like your imagination. I like the way you think, kid. Well, look, there are hints in those readings that this discovery of the Hall of Records could have come forward earlier. I happen to think that it was botched. I think there was an opportunity in the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s, and that somehow this was submerged and it's come around now, and that it comes around in phases. But yeah, I don't think there's any question that there's a great responsibility with its discovery. But the other thing is there's an archaeology war over the contents that are there, because that's getting us deep again into the human origin story. And the people who are running the world at this stage don't want us anywhere near that type of information unless it's co-opted to a fashion. So like the UFO file, you keep the secrecy and the wall of secrecy in place. You ridicule anybody who's into it. You make it an entertainment thing over here. But at a certain point, a breaking point, you decide, well, too many people are going to get into this. There's no way we can, kind of give up the advantage. So let's co-opt the entire story and just roll off our version of it that still puts us in charge, leaves us in charge. But that's nowhere near the truth. So on the other hand, you have these mystery school groups that are saying we need to, move the culture forward. What are we going to do? And that's why you see dramatic things coming out all the way from, say, 1850 to the present day that, but there's an explosion there of things like yoga, psychic experience, reincarnation, near-death experience, all this stuff that comes out in this wave in the West. And some of it, the East has been associated with a mysticism tradition for a long time. But in the West, it's been submerged and tight. But to release a kind of Christian Western mysticism and to have the esoteric Christian vision for this, that is the kind of power play that will open up, for the ages, what's going on here. And you see groups trying to co-opt the interest levels that people have. And people have kind of lived and died with a lot of these questions, whether it's, our ancient past or the UFO file, whatever. People have researched it right down the line. And they spent their lives researching it. And, if you think about it, it's an intergenerational situation at this point where we have had groups and grandmothers, great-grandfathers and all the rest of it looking at this stuff and wondering what was going on, all the way from, you know, the Tesla work to the early work of the mystery schools, the Cayce Foundation, the Gurdjieff schools. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. And there's some core thread that I've found through all of it, which is the information comes forward. It does not, you know, it doesn't force itself for people to use it, but the information comes forward and sits there in a mystery tradition, sitting in the middle of that society. And if the people in that society can get their hands on that information, it can help wake them up, and they can get control over their own future and humanity's spiritual evolution. No small feat there. This is exactly what's going on in the background. Miss Olivia.
Rat Boy Genius, did Cayce say if the Hall of Records pyramid was built underground, or did it used to be on the surface and is now buried like it sank?
No, it was always, it was placed underground, and the Sphinx was set on top as a sentinel, according to Cayce. I'm going to read, I've selected some very careful pieces here to kind of get us right to the heart of this. And I'm going to focus on the Sphinx Hall of Records, but there's information here relating to the Great Pyramid as well, and the prophecies that come along with it. I'm just going to take you through a couple of readings here, and then I'm going to show how this track lays itself out. I'm also going to give you the name of the person whose face appears on the Sphinx. You ready for that one? Did anyone know that that name was hanging out there deep in the Cayce readings? It is. And I want to say this, take it or leave it, that Edgar Cayce, as he went back through these various lives of these other people, he found himself as a priest back there named Ratta. And Ratta was in the heart of all this. So sometimes when we think about why would Cayce have all this access to this Atlantis information, he had lived through it. And so that is Cayce's work, like Steiner's work, like Blavatsky's work, takes us into a reincarnation track where we've been here and we store those memories of those previous lives. And I think with reincarnation, you know, it comes around in some ways. You know, some people think that it's useful. Some people don't believe in it, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. But I will tell you that in the work, in the Cayce work, in the mystery school work in general, the idea of a developmental stage of incarnation is crucial. And it's not just here. We incarnate through planetary sojourns in different types of bodies, not in physical bodies on Neptune or whatever, but we go through these different stages. And those stages include development around certain types of qualities that the planets are associated with. And then he also talks about the doorway out of this system. So there's a lot of things here to consider that, you know, the idea of a galactic federation doesn't really cut. You know, we're really talking about physical life here and then moving into some kind of astral field, going into these other planets and having a body that is suitable to that environment. So it has nothing to do with, you know, you go and reincarnate on another planet in a physical body. You incarnate into the wave of that planet, and then you come back around here. In fact, if you look at the work of Rudolf Steiner, one of the things that he is claiming as a block on all this is the harmonic activity to stop that process, the natural flow of spiritual evolution, and to create this whole thing about the eighth sphere so that we reincarnate through this very coarse, illusionary eighth sphere instead. So that goes very deep.
Oh, I just had a realization.
Yeah.
Well, you know, they're talking about how there are more starseeds incarnated at this time. And it would make sense that if they're from a higher dimension or a higher vibration plane, and coming into a human form to basically help fight Ahriman so that humanity as a group, as a collective, doesn't descend. You know,
Yes.
not just, I mean, obviously everybody's talking about 5D and ascension, but beyond that, just basically that we don't descend.
Yes, right? Absolutely. It's interesting you said that because one of the crucial things that they asked Cayce, is the Armageddon prophesied in the Great Pyramid? Because he said there was a number of prophecies in the Great Pyramid. And one of the questions they had asked him about was Armageddon. But they said, well, are any of these prophecies in great detail, and Cayce said, well, some of the prophecies go down to the date, the name of the street, the last name of the family that the person grew up on. How's that for specific? So there's something about the Great Pyramid which is extraordinary on this level if we can read it. And when he talked about Armageddon, it's fascinating. He said, you have to understand Armageddon is this. It's a war fought in the air over a 1,000-year period of those emissaries coming in to Earth, basically to incarnate and clean it up, and those preventing them from entering. So that's the whole harmonic thing. And whenever I've looked into the work around Blavatsky and Steiner and Cayce, I always find these linkages that basically one person's work answers the other over and over again. And not that they're going to agree on every single date or whatever it happens to be, but it is fascinating to me how those things seem to kind of be interlocked with each other on some level, coming from definitely different traditions. Okay, so here is someone coming to Edgar Cayce for a reading where he will go into trance and he will read their subconscious mind to find out the answer to the question they're going to ask. And he tells this one person that she was in Egypt during this period when they were setting up the Hall of Records. And again, the Hall of Records now, he indicates, is beneath the Sphinx. And it is the entrance is beneath the right paw of the Sphinx. And then it's in a pyramid of its own between the Sphinx and the river. So he says, the question is, where are the records or tablets made of that Egyptian experience I had, which I might study? And the answer is, in the tomb of records, as indicated, for the entity's tomb was then a part of the Hall of Records, which has not been uncovered. It lies between or along the entrance from the Sphinx to the pyramid, in a pyramid, of course, of its own. So instantly, the Hall of Records is a pyramid. This is the crucial thing. This is what we brought out in the Pyramid X documentary, but it goes deeper. It says, how may I now find those records, or should I wait, or must I wait? And then he says, well, you'll find the records by that channel as indicated. These records may actually be obtained mentally. Now that's interesting because everyone thinks I'm going to go to the Hall of Records and get this or whatever. And here's Cayce saying, again, reach out with your mind. We think of things in such a materialistic way, but here's Cayce accessing these things with his mind, and he's suggesting that she do the same thing. And he said, as for physical records, it will be necessary to wait until the full time has come for the breaking up of much that has been in the nature of selfish motives in the world. So this kind of goes along with your question, which is what happens if the wrong people get their hands on it? Apparently, there's some sort of fail-safe about the condition of the world and if the world is ready, as it were. For remember, these records were made from the angle of world movements. So must your activities be in the present of a universal approach, but applied as an individual. It's interesting to note when talking about the Hall of Records, I mentioned that some of them, because they're 3 different places, but they're all the same records. And the ones in Yucatan, he actually mentions specifically, which I find fascinating. So I attached that to this one. It said, how did the lost tribe reach this country? Now, this is very interesting because there's a lost tribe in the Bible, and they come over. No one knows what actually happens to them. But according to Cayce, they come over to America. And he said, well, they arrive in boats. Now, they've learned that this travel is not as difficult as they used to think in history, and that you can take a boat from the Mediterranean across the Atlantic. But for years and years, they hung off on that, so you could never say there was an association with the Mayans, for example, and the Egyptians. Well, we've learned that that's false. Have the most important temples and pyramids been discovered? And this is speaking about the Mayans. Cayce says, those of the first civilization have been discovered and have not all been opened, but their associations, their connections are being replaced or being attempted to be rebuilt. Many of the second and third civilizations may never be discovered. That's interesting. They're too deep underground, perhaps. By what power or powers were those early pyramids and temples constructed? By the lifting forces and those gases that are being used gradually in the present civilization. Also by the fine, unique work or activities of those versed in that pertaining to the source from which all power comes. So he's talking about a group that's tuning in and channeling that energy in order to build pyramids and temples and things of that nature. And he's incorporating this other piece, which is, well, just like you're discovering how to build things now, they were already doing that. In which pyramid or temple are the records mentioned in the readings given through this channel on Atlantis in April 1932? He said, as given, that temple was destroyed at the time there was the last destruction of Atlantis. Yet as the time draws nigh, when these changes are about to happen, there may be an opening of those three places where the records are won. So to those that are initiates in the knowledge of God, the temple by Iltar, which is the Yucatan temple, he first built the temple in Poseidon, which is the one that went down. That's the one that's off Bimini now, the Bimini Road. The temple by Iltar will then rise again. Also, there will be the opening of the temple or hall of records in Egypt. And those records that were put into the heart of the Atlantean land may also be found there. There they have been kept for those that are of that group. The records are one. It's the same stuff. It's here in this hemisphere. It's over there in Egypt. So he's talking about the Egyptian Hall of Records, and he says, in the record chambers, there were more ceremonies than calling into the people and finishing of that called the pyramid. Now, this takes us into 10,500 BC, where the initiates from Atlantis have hooked up with basically the holy men that are in native Egypt. They've combined forces, and they're saying, we're going to do these sacred ceremonies and store the Atlantean records here for the ages. And he said, for those that were trained in the Temple Beautiful were about the sealing of the record chambers. For these were to be kept and had been given by the priests in Atlantis or Poseidon. These records of the race, of the development of the laws pertaining to one, were put in the chambers and to be opened only when there was the returning of those into materiality or to earth experience, when the change that was imminent in the earth. Now, this change that he's talking about is a period. So he's talking about them reincarnating in this period between 1958 and 1998. This is the period of time. So if you think about it, the people who will be discovering these things will be born somewhere in that corridor between 58 and 98. These influences have been given by many in the records that have been kept by those sojourning in the land of the Semitic peoples. The sealing of these activities by Ratta and Isis and the king, whose name is Ararat, there were the gatherings of all those in the temples, the record sealing, with incense from the altars of the temple and the altars for the cleansing of those for their activities in the grounds about the tomb or temple of records. Many were the cleansing from people from those things or conditions that separated them from the association of the lower kingdom that had brought activities in all lands from the worship of Belial. And as the desires from these influences of carnal associations. This is where he starts to talk about the automatons and how the scientists had integrated the various things like animal matter with human matter and mineral and created these beings that could do all their work, farming. They made them artisans and all the rest. The only problem was they treated them like robots. And so since they had this human tissue in them, Ratta is creating a process to basically cleanse them of the cyborg and animal influence and make them human beings again. So you can see the story brings us into deeper, when we start to look at what the Sphinx and the pyramid are all about, we're getting into deep territory. Now, when Cayce talks about the time, it's very interesting. He said, this was the period as given 10,500 years before the entering of the Prince of Peace into the land of Egypt to study, to become an initiate in those same activities that were set up originally by Hepsut and Ratta and the others that were set up there that he discusses. So what we're looking at is Cayce telling us this is what they were doing. And then later, Jesus will become an initiate. He'll be going through this kind of white brotherhood initiation in the pyramid. And in fact, in the, what they call the empty tomb now, the sarcophagus that is just there in the pyramid, nobody understands the function of what that is or what the symbolism is. And they all assume, well, it's an empty sarcophagus. I guess a king was buried there once. According to Cayce, no, it's a symbolic gesture by that brotherhood, and you lie in that for 3 days like you're dead, and then you take up your body again. So in the whole resurrection story of Jesus, when he rolls the rock away and comes out of the tomb, it's the same process here that's taking place in this pyramid. Now, there's a whole resurrection factor there, but I'm going to keep on with the Hall of Records story, and we're going to go a little bit deeper on this. Now, there's a group back here in the 40s who's trying to find, who's trying to say, well, how did the Hall of Records come about, and can I be a part of this, and all the rest of it. And Cayce has had a knack now of being able to project out of who's going to bring this work out. As a matter of fact, there's a guy famously 21 years after Cayce has passed away, and he is told by his publisher, we really want to do a book on this guy, but Cayce's story has been hanging out there, and people have kind of forgotten about who he was, and he's been dead for a long time, and he never sought great fame when he was alive or whatever. So you have this New York Times reporter named Jess Stern, and the publisher says, yeah, go for it. Do some research on him. See if this is viable. We'll do a book on him and his psychic stuff. So he goes to Virginia Beach and he's looking through the records, trying to get information about Cayce and all the rest. So he gets to this one reading where they're asking Cayce, how will you spread, how the information gets spread around the world? And he lists a couple of names, and right in the middle of it, he lists Stern, which is the guy who's looking at it, the New York Times reporter 20 years later. So Cayce back there, 1944, when they're asking who's going to bring this out to the world, the author of the best-selling book of Cayce called The Sleeping Prophet, which makes him kind of a hero in that hippie era, and all these things that come out about Atlantis and psychic experience, he's identified in the reading itself. So you see Cayce's seeing across time and tuning in about what's going to happen there. This is an extraordinary example of the kind of psychic ability that he had. But stories like that are just off the charts and they're undeniable. Yes, Miss Olivia.
So Tim Houston says, Hall of Records, in what form are these records? And Ivan Langley says, crystal records maybe? Holographic records stored in crystals?
Well, remember that the pyramid itself, when he was talking about, how can you get prophecies in this pyramid? How accurate are they? And Cayce says, well, if you can learn to read the prophecies in the pyramid, you can get it down to the last name of the person, the family name of the person, the name of the street they grew up on, the year they're going to be born. So there's something extraordinary about this process. The way to read it, according to what he was talking about, was literally the measurements of what we're talking about. So the curvature, for example, of the king's chamber, there's a kind of a mathematical formula for reading this, and also the type of stone that is used. So there are a number of reports about what's in the Hall of Records. One of the things that Cayce says is that all of the information about the TUAOI stone and its construction are there. Now, the TUAOI stone was the most amazing interface for spiritual interaction on the planet. And they would train these people to use the TUAOI stone to interact with what he called the saintly realm, right? The outer realms. Well, it was also used to basically blow up Atlantis. So you can see it represents a great jump, a great challenge for humanity to discover this. But of course, This is the emerging out of the subconscious of this deep story that Cayce's telling. The other thing I think we can think about in relation to this is he talks about 32 tablets. And there's a lot about this number 32 that gets adopted later, including, of course, Masonic lodges borrow a number of these, like 33 and 32. But I think that the number there, just like you have the 10 commandments and things of this nature, the 32 tablets, there's some formula, I would say, to that. There's some hint or key to exactly how we would read these records. In some of these cases, he's also talked about musical instruments and things like that being in there, and tools for raising vibrations and things of this nature. Now, here he talks about it in detail. They say, give in detail what the sealed room contains. And he says, a record of Atlantis from the beginnings of those periods when the spirit took form or began the encasement in the land and the development of the people through their sojourn, with the record of the first destruction of Atlantis and the changes that took place in the land, with the record of the sojournings of the people and their varied activities in other lands, a record of the meeting of all the nations or lands for the activities of the destruction that became necessary for the final destruction of Atlantis and the building of the pyramid of initiation. With who, what, where would come the opening of the records that are as copies from the sunken Atlantis. Remember, there's 3 of these. For with the change, the earth changes, it must rise, the temple, again. That's the temple that's rising off Bimini. Remember, land rising. You never hear about land rising. It is land rising is a core aspect in any of the mystery school activity. And the land that's rising is off the east coast of America. That's how all of this is getting set off. So when we look at the moves that are happening on the earth right now, including the wars and the various kind of digital control systems and things like that, they're getting ahead of a process that they know is happening right in the heart of it all. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 221, the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records Pyramid X breakthrough. We're going to be taking your questions. We've been kind of integrating the questions in as we go here. So we'll just do a short Q&A section at the end. I want to remind you, if you haven't already, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It is a free newsletter, but that is crucial to get around the intense, and I mean intense, censorship of this channel and the work that we're doing because of the things that we're putting out. And it's very quick and easy. You go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and you will find out about the incredible interviews we have coming up for you in April and May, off the charts like you won't believe. And stunning X-Series episodes, fascinating docuseries work, of course, JFK and the UFO File, the things we're bringing out in that docuseries, and Pyramid X, which is all about exactly what we're talking about tonight, this incredible rediscovery of humanity, and the craze in the hot zone, hacking Atlantis. All of this, all of these series are there, and they're all there at your fingertips, really. You'll get updates on all of them, events, things that are happening, interviews, all the rest of it, and where I'll be appearing on shows here and there. I don't do too many interviews, and I'll tell you, when doing the interviews with Alex are some of my favorite things in the world to do. One of the things I want to do is get him on this show, because he has so many fascinating experiences himself, and he has a great understanding of many of the topics that we talk about, although they're not a kind of central focus of the type of work that he does. I've always been amazed at the kind of insight that he has around these things. But all that's there in the newsletter. Stand up and be counted. Make sure you're on board with that, Miss Olivia.
The Buddhist Boston sports. I don't know if you've heard of the book Transylvania Sunrise, but it's about a Sphinx in Romania and the U.S. Army getting into a Hall of Records under it. In that book, it's a table that you put your hands on, and it projects a hologram in front of you and shows the history of the world, or can show you your body on a cellular level. Debbie Shoemaker says the Busegi Cave in Romania has a holographic history of humanity that goes back 50,000 years, supposedly.
Well, we have these themes, don't we? Just like there are a number of sphinxes in different cultures. Like there's the Babylonian Sphinx, there's the winged Sphinx, there's the Grecian version. You know, there's some Sphinx that have female characteristics. I'll tell you what's very interesting is if you look at some of the very early University of Pennsylvania items, and I will say that Cayce said a number of the depictions of the two-eye stone coming out of these digs in Yucatan were sent directly to the University of Pennsylvania. One of the things you'll find, and I've done episodes on this, are all of these imported sphinxes, and they all kind of line up in front of those colleges and certain departments, you know, science departments, history departments. They've got these Egyptian versions of these sphinxes directly in front of these various departments. And that was a major trend that was happening, I would say, probably between like 1910 and 1940. It's extraordinary how much Egyptian overlay there is on everything. And when it gets to some of the observatories and things like the Palomar Observatory, the guy who put that together was so obsessed with Akhenaten that he put together a 60-foot carving of Akhenaten at the front of the entrance around his Caltech office. I mean, you know, these people are very tuned in to the Egyptian mysticism and magic and what it represents, as it were. But the Sphinxes, for sure, bring us into a different territory. I always like these overhead shots of the Sphinx. I think it gives us this incredible idea of the grandeur of this. And remember Cayce saying the Sphinx is the sentinel, the guardian of the Hall of Records, and the passageway that can be opened. He said, as the sun drops between the paws, that'll show you that the right paw of the Sphinx is the entryway to the Great Pyramid beneath, which is Pyramid X. That's the Hall of Records. Now, I can tell you also that one of the extraordinary things that has happened to me over time is when I've talked to some of the best, and I mean the top experts in relation to this, for some reason, even these incredible experts think it's the left paw that's being discussed there. No, over and over again. It's been checked and double checked and triple checked. It's the right paw of the Sphinx. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Wayshowers says, does DJ know that Elon reposted your post yesterday?
No, I was not aware of that.
I'm asking which post it was.
Yes,
That's
absolutely
exciting.
fascinating. Yeah, really interesting. Well, you know, he's going.
He has great reach.
He's going.
That's a big opportunity.
He's going deep into space. Yeah, I would love to. You can actually, just like with anything kind of interesting like that you want me to look at, just send it to admin@darkjournalist.com, and I would love to check that out. But wouldn't that be absolutely? I bet that's amazing. What else you got?
Oh God, I don't know where. There's so much good stuff. Okay, so Kevin Conley said 32 tablets, 32 paths of wisdom on the tree of life. So it's 10 spheres and 22 connecting paths. So you said there are 32 tablets that are the Hall of Records.
Yes.
Okay.
They're in there.
Does that have anything to do? I think immediately 33, 32 basins, certain levels.
I did mention it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mentioned those, and there's no question. I think there's a key in 32. I think if we look at it, we're going to discover it. It's very interesting because these things operate also in reverse. And this is a weird thing to mention, but you know, all those deaths that are associated in the rock music world that were all those 27 Club and all the rest of it. So it's quite interesting. There was a whole Masonic battle over the fact of this 27 piece, and it was all about Cagliostro, and Cagliostro saying the magic number for the human being was 5,527, and that is the age lifespan that they should have. But there's whole kind of mix up about 27 and the Masons at that point. And I couldn't help but think, I was like, oh yeah, the 27 Club. Isn't that interesting? You know how these things work.
Blue Band says, never weird with you, DJ.
Mm. All right, Ratta. How does Ratta play into all this? Let me tell you a few things about Ratta. He's a previous incarnation of Edgar Cayce. He is the high priest in Egypt he's come in with this group from basically Iran. And that group now have taken over Egypt. Now he had a psychic vision that they were supposed to go there. And the tribe regards him very strangely because he is the son of a daughter of Zu, and as it's put in the readings, without human father. So either Ratta or his mother is, the daughter of something that's not human, or the son of something that's not human. Yeah.
Okay.
There's no question. So either it's a Nephilim, it's something quite unusual that's going on there. And he is incredibly religious, and he does all these incredible things, including rejuvenates himself. Remember, there's a theme of resurrection here. Well, when he's old, he's been exiled to Libya. And, the kind of evil priests in Egypt have said, we've had enough of this guy trying to straighten the society out and all these things that he's introduced, and the Atlantean initiation thing. We want to turn this into a totally different kind of Egypt. And they exile him for 40 years. But at a certain point, enough of the people in Egypt want him to come back, but he's so old and worn down by all the stress of the things that have happened. He has to go back and use the TUAOI stone process for rejuvenating himself. And in fact, he does. He comes back like a young man again. So the story of Ratta is an incredible story, because what happens is when he comes into Egypt, Cayce describes him as having no hair on his body. He's bald, no eyebrows. And he strikes me as somebody who is basically the visionary for the tribe. And they go to him over and over again and say, what should we do next? And he's the one who points this kind of tribe from Persia directly into Egypt in 10,500 BC. The reason is it's part of the setup that he knows Atlantis is going down. And what he does is he creates kind of a theme there in Egypt for the king and all the rest, and they kind of take over, and they have this new basis of operations. And he sets up a team to do archaeology for where they should place the Atlantean records. Then he goes into Poseidia, he goes to Atlantis, and he spends 20 years absorbing all of the initiates' information. They're working with him. Of course, we have this fantastic Nanette Christ painting of Ratta, which any opportunity I show. I think it's such a powerful, remarkable painting that she did, just capturing the essence of Cayce as Ratta, this incredible Emilius priest, coming into the Atlantean land and bringing forward with these other initiates this whole thing about the Giza Plateau and storing the records there for humanity's future. Now, one of the things I want to say about Ratta also is he's kind of trying to make a perfect human. And what he's doing is he's taking the automatons and he is removing their cyborg, animal impurities. And there's a whole process there about how we developed hospitals based on what he was doing there. But what Cayce describes as the Temple Beautiful, it's very interesting because it sounds like a hospital with a spiritual background where they're working on the vibrational level of the people that are taken in there, and they come out totally different. And in some cases, he's saying the cure for some of them is almost immediate, and it involves surgery and other things. So whatever it was that Ratta was doing is medical. And so here we have Cayce coming back, and he is doing what when he goes into these trances? He's giving medical reading. And he'll give medical readings for over 40 years. And over again, we have testimonials, affidavits, and all the rest of it, that he was giving this incredible information. He's actually referred to as the father of holistic medicine because of those readings. So we have somebody who's continuing on the tradition. And as I said, not somebody who's using that power and being like, hey, it costs $10,000 a session to sit with me for 30 minutes. As a matter of fact, there's a guy who's an assistant of his who said, well, one of the things that used to happen all the time is that people would send him this money, and then he would tell the assistant to send the money back to basically clarify to people, like, do you understand, you don't have to send this money, and it's up to you, but I don't want the money. If you want to become a member, you can send me the money to become part of the membership or whatever. And the guy talked about this feeling that he had. He's like, it's just something absolutely anti-business about sending money back. But that's the type of individual that Cayce was, working with this. And, he got into situations where there's a fascinating piece of time there where there's a couple of stockbrokers from New York who are getting all these readings on stocks, but they're also getting all the spiritual information. And those are the Blumenthals, and they are, multi-millionaires. And they're supporting his activities, and they actually build a Cayce hospital at a certain point. But then they say, you can only give readings for these people or people we select, and you can't give readings for these other people. And the minute they say that, he won't go along with it. And they pull the funding from the hospital. And it's very interesting because Cayce will struggle with these things all of his life. Whenever he gets up to a point where things are going to be happening for him, comes down over and over again. There's some kind of spiritual battle there with material abundance in Cayce's life. And I think, there's a reason for that, maybe in his own past lives, but it's also a great challenge, I think, which is continue to put yourself on the high road. And there's a point where his own father and an opportunist doctor that doctor's interesting. His name is Ketchum, and he did bring Cayce to notice, got him in the New York Times and things. But at a certain point, he's trying to make money off of Cayce, and the father is helping him. And I want to say this about Cayce's dad. He wasn't, Cayce had all the ethics there. And the father was a little more, trying to get things done no matter what. And it's also interesting to note the lineage that the grandfather of Cayce, Thomas Jefferson Cayce, had psychic ability, and he could do things like lift tables. He could levitate tables. He had the gift, and it was like a family secret. And he was very close with young Edgar. And what happens is he goes to have, into a pond to give the horse a drink or whatever, and the horse throws him. And the grandfather dies, drowning. And Cayce can't, because he doesn't know how to swim. He's a 5-year-old boy. He's looking out. He just has to watch him. And what happens, he's very traumatized by the whole thing. But then the grandfather starts showing up, and he can see him just like he was there the whole time. And he tells his parents, and they're like, oh, you keep talking like that, we'll send you off to an institution. And he said, no, I saw Grandpa John, he was there, and we were talking and all the rest of it. And he has in his own memory, when he talks about this, he has long interactions with the grandfather for a long, long time. So something instantly that tells you he's working on a different level, a different plane. Yeah, what do you got?
There is something about the Sphinx in the Yucatan. Okay, Deep State, you're fired. Let me go back and find this. Here we go. Yeah. DJ, was the botched revealing of the Hall of Records you mentioned, was that the Sphinx in the Yucatan found and disappeared again? And Scarmoj says, AP reported in 1930 that the Boy Scouts discovered, quote, a large stone Sphinx bearing a marked resemblance to that in Egypt, in Guerrero, Mexico. On the Yucatan Sphinx, see the article, da-da-da-da. So,
well, yeah, we put that, all of that is in Pawgate from 2023, and all the information about that Sphinx. I even have a picture of that Sphinx, the Yucatan Sphinx there. This is very interesting because nobody correlates, they correlate the Sphinx with these other cultures like Greece and the Babylonians and stuff, but nobody had correlated the Sphinx with the Mayan culture. This was an extraordinary thing. And we put it in there because that idea of Pawgate, if you talk about where the other Hall of Records in the Yucatan was, it's Piedras Negras. And if you go deep enough into the linguistics around it, the place where it is called the Paw Stone, or the Black Paw Stone, and the whole, so you're getting into what that brotherhood is, their piece, and the thing that Cayce brought forward. He's telling us it's beneath the right paw. This is the signature of that particular mystery group. So yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. And we put the whole story about the Yucatan Sphinx in there, and I highly recommend. That's a very rich thing that you can make a Sphinx disappear. Who took it? They could have been selling it on the black market, but this is an extraordinary effort. And it reminds me so much of all the Smithsonian things that don't agree with history. If they find giants or whatever, they're not going to share that information. There's a group in charge around the Smithsonian, and they are, that's where this whole deep state backdrop comes from. The Rockefellers are very, very locked into all of this, whether it comes just like Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie, his big fascination was what? Was dinosaurs. And before anyone could say anything, the minute dinosaur bones were found anywhere, his team was there and dragging them back to his museum. Could it have been a weird fetish, or is it something much, much deeper with an esoteric edge, including the fact that they could have been dating the ruins, or they could have been dating the bones of the dinosaurs in order to figure out when this had all taken place? We get all of this information in history about the dinosaurs in 65 million BC being wiped out by a comet. Well, it's pretty extraordinary 65 million years ago, because you have Cayce talking about the Atlanteans trying to get rid of the dinosaurs at 50,722 BC. How do you get that much of a gap? So there's something weird about the dinosaur story in any case. Yes. All right. So we'll go deeper now. Let's go a little bit further into what he has to say about the records here. So they're trying to dig out of him exactly where is this Hall of Records. Give us like a specific location. And they say, well, if the king's chamber is on the 50th course, on what course is the sealed room? Now, this is what they're calling the Hall of Records. And Cayce says the sealed room of records is in a different place, not in this great pyramid. So it's not in the pyramid. That's for a fact. And says, given detail what the sealed room contains. And he talks about the record of Atlantis. Now, then it says, well, he's talking to these different people about, you have to be careful. You have to kind of purify yourself if you're going to be part of the team that retrieves this. And so he's talking about this, and they go into it, but I'm going to jump to another reading on this, which is, yeah, so here it says, where are those records or tablets made of that Egyptian experience which I might study? And he says, in the tomb of records as indicated, for this entity's tomb was part of the Hall of Records. So now we have the sealed room, we have the tomb, we have the temple, and we have the pyramid. So which is it? Apparently all of these things correlate, which is you have a pyramid, which acts as a temple, and then you have a sealed room inside of this pyramid, and that is that's going to be where this is. Now, here's the next sort of piece that I think is interesting on this. Another reading for an individual looking back into their past life about where they were in Egypt during the making of this Hall of Records. He says, before that, we find the entity was in the rule when the king and the Egyptian forces gave the greater knowledge of the indwelling of the divine in the then human forces in the earth plane. The entity then was in the name of Arsha and was the stone and precious stone designer and carver for the entity or ruler Ararat. This is the Ratta period. The entity also gave geometrical forces to the people, being then the mathematician, astrologer, and soothsayer of the day. That's quite a triple play. He arranged then for the first monuments that were being restored and builded in those places, being the founder of now what is the mysteries of mysteries, the Sphinx. Now, and they say, what is the name of the ruler during this entity's sojourn in Egypt? And they say, Ararat. In what capacity did this entity act in the building of the Sphinx? As the monuments were being rebuilt in the plains of that period and in the place now called the Pyramid of Giza, this entity builded, laid the foundations, superintended same, figured out the geometrical position of same in relation to the buildings that were put up and connected to the Sphinx. And the data concerning same may be found in the vaults at the base of the Sphinx. We see this Sphinx was builded as this. And he gives the entire detail here, but I'll give just a little bit of it. The excavations were made for the Sphinx in the plains above where the temple of Isis had stood during the deluge. So this is going much, much further back. Again, it's a sacred spot. They were doing their own archaeology. Now, the deluge, who knows? When did that happen? 25,000 BC, somewhere in there. There's a destruction of Atlantis. And he said the temple of Isis had stood there during the deluge, occurring some centuries before, when this people came in from the north country and took possession of the rule of Egypt, setting up the first dynasty, 10,500 BC, not 3,000 BC. The entity was with that dynasty and also in the second dynasty when those buildings were begun. The base of the Sphinx was laid out in channels. In the corner facing the Giza pyramid may be found the wording of how this was founded, giving the history of the first invading ruler and the ascension of Ararat to that position. So they already have it. They must have it. If he's saying, well, all that is laid out and it's on the Sphinx, it's on the cornerstone that's facing the pyramid, they must have found that a long time ago. So we never hear anything about that because it would confirm the dating system and all the rest. But here we are in the middle of all this, and he's telling us, well, you can actually find it. The name is there. So let's do this for a moment. We're going to jump around here to another mystery school initiate who's on the scene in the 30s and 40s, and he starts pointing out the same information that Cayce does. Now, they're pretty contemporary, and this guy probably is a lower profile guy, but he's written some books and shared some information over in the UK. Not as much is known about him. We have some kind of scant information that at a certain point, he was an RAF pilot. He was also a performer. Apparently, he was a singer, and he was a Knights Templar. So he's very familiar as a Knights Templar with all the different things that are going on in relation to what mystery schools would be using buildings like this for. One of the things that he does is he starts to show in his books now, and these are in the 1930s, he's starting to show beneath the Sphinx, we've got something. And the kind of glowing aspect of that, I think, is to show, okay, this is what's beneath the Sphinx. And he starts to talk about all the chambers beneath the Sphinx and how this is part of an initiation and how this will lead to humanity's reemergence and all the rest. His name is H.C. Randall Stevens. And his series of books are a little hard to find, but they're out there. Atlantis in the Latter Days is one of the classics in relation to this. And again, we have these plates of the Sphinx, and then beneath it, we're seeing something. It looks like he's referring to the Hall of Records directly here as well. Now, remember, Cayce has the dating up here for the Great Pyramid and then the Sphinx at 10,500 BC. That's 8,000 years earlier. So there's a gigantic discrepancy in how traditional archaeology and science looks at this. So Cayce's giving us a totally different dating system for the entire thing. And now here's this Randall Stevens coming out and basically supporting the whole thing. He's also, though, on this very, very kind of mystical track. Yes. What do you got?
Nana Moore says, are there Cayce readings about Atlantis related to Antarctica? And does DJ have insights on blue sky ice in Antarctica? It doesn't melt, it evaporates. I want to mention one thing.
Yeah.
That's a synchronicity. So blue sky is what Steve Gomez calls the blue meth in Breaking Bad.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we have.
It's only like one episode where he mentions that.
So I'll tell you, this gets into something, and I'll bring more of this out when we talk about the missing generals the next time. But one of the things I brought up on the Alex show, and really I think gets us into a totally interesting territory, is all about the template that's being used around the missing generals and the missing scientists. And it's very interesting because I was able to tell Alex, I got so much from him over the years about predictive programming. And I think he's basically a master at figuring out how they do those sorts of things. And all of the things that you see about, oh, they put this in a Simpsons thing or they put this in a Batman movie. Alex was always way on top of that before anybody. And one of the things I ran by him, and he started to give me incredible kind of details about how this operates, was that I was seeing a pattern here relating directly to the missing generals and the missing scientists about Breaking Bad. And it's so weird because, of course, McCaslin, who's the main figure who's missing here, and then all the associates around him, but he was in Albuquerque, and that's where the show, of course, takes place. And, of course, we find out that Walter White is the figure who was this fantastic scientist, but he worked at Los Alamos as well. So there's a gigantic crisscross, and I put together, like we do with steganography and X-steganography and other things, so many points around this that it was becoming mind-boggling. So the steganography was there, it was thick. And so I'm going to share the full kind of gist of this, but we put some of it on the record with Alex, that there's something about the McCaslin disappearance that relates directly as a pattern, as a template overlay, as it were, to the show Breaking Bad, as extraordinary as that sounds. And if there weren't so many different bullet points and corollaries associated with it, I wouldn't have even brought it up. I would have thought it was an interesting kind of fascination of my own. Yeah.
Buddhist of Boston Sports says, and RFK Jr. has been using methylene blue. They coded that in the show for a reason. RFK Jr. uses the inverse. Meth blue, not blue meth.
Oh,
wow.
Right. Oh, that's really true. Well, there's a lot of things, of course. The entire program that we identified about the UFO file and the secret space program was called Blue. And we did the documentary Blue in relation to it. And the government, it's a very odd story because we came out with that in March of 2023. And we had rock solid sources for it. I'd been researching it for 5, 6 years. So I knew what the program was and I knew what the name of it was. And as soon as we put that out, all these counterintelligence people started to get in touch with me and they were like, yeah, I really want to share the UFO file stuff with you. By the way, where'd you get that name Blue? How'd you know, And that I found interesting immediately. But the real kind of kicker to the whole thing was when the government came forward in March of 2024, and they said, you know what? Actually, we did have a program called Blue, and it was all about UFO retrieval. But since we didn't retrieve anything, it's no big deal, and it's just a red herring or whatever. No, that's been the name of the program, and we've brought it forward. And it's interesting because one of the things that was going on there at Wright-Patterson, where these people were using the Roswell material to develop this memory metal, and that gets us into a very high stakes technological conversation, is there's the Blue Room there at Wright-Patterson, where famously Curtis LeMay told Senator and former presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, who was his good friend, if you ever ask me about that Blue Room again, I'll never speak to you. And that's a promise. So they knew what they were keeping there, but this was the team that was involved. And I'll bring all the details that I have about this, but I will say this: when you get around the Walter White aspect of this, you are dealing directly with some kind of messaging, some template overlay from that show to the missing people, including the fact of the phone call, because you remember that Walter White disappears into the desert and they don't know where he is. And he shows up in a fugue state later on. But the calls made to the police about where he is, and then when you listen to the McCaslin call that his wife calls to 911, I'm not saying there's anything strange about her. I'm just saying it's all very odd because it sounds exactly like the call that's made on behalf of Walter White. So Albuquerque, the fact of the Los Alamos connection, and then there's a lot more, even the things that I brought up in the Alex show. So I'll bring the full thing forward, but you're on notice here. There's something going on in relation, in my opinion, using steganography to that program and the disappearance of General McCaslin, which I think is much more important. I mean, it's getting the media attention now. We've sent all this information out to media outlets, but I'll tell you, when you get X-Protect coming out forward like that and grabbing somebody and his team, you're in totally different waters, in my opinion. Yes. What do you got?
Golden Warrior, what happened to the sphere that was brought up by from the pyramids out from Cuba a few years ago?
I'm not familiar with a sphere. There is, of course, the Craze in the Hot Zone, which is all the Polina Zalitsky work, where she found an entire metropolis off the western tip of Cuba. And we reported on that and we brought it forward. And it's very interesting because it got pirated by so many different people who didn't know anything about it, that I think this was a move to obscure it. And it got so bad at a certain point that I had to legally caution the people who were doing it. And temporarily they have not been plagiarizing it as hard. But, the Hot Zone work was completely unique. It's something we've developed since, for the last decade. And we have something like 45 episodes dealing with it. And to see these people, I've already put them on record and we've already talked about this, but there's something very strange, in my opinion, about that, because it's very clear that the way that they were doing it was so obvious. And, I don't think any of that stuff is by mistake, especially given the kind of attention that was given to it. And I pointed it out directly to the people who were doing it as well. So we'll see. If there's any more of that activity, I'll be all over it. Trust me. But it's very important to keep that story for what it is. And anyone can use the material and study the material if they're citing the source. But it's not the kind of thing where you can do a 3-hour program, use all the material, use the entire series crux and what's going on there and all the characters that are involved in the Hot Zone. And then at the end of it say, oh yeah, I think there's some guy named Dark Journalist who might've got into this too. No, if you go and steal somebody's work, you're a plagiarist, and we point out plagiarism very heavily. But just casual plagiarism is one thing. I see rampant plagiarism when it comes to this stuff. And, I like to sort of do my own research and have other people do their own research. And I do my part to kind of cite all my sources when I get to things. But when you get something as naked as that around the Hot Zone, so many people pointed this out, and we've seen it before. Jesse Michaels is the same thing. But see, this gets into weird territory because Peter Thiel is behind Jesse Michaels. And so is it Peter Thiel that's plagiarizing the material then and funding this program as a counterpoint? I don't think there's any reason to keep this conversation in the shadows. Why are these people such plagiarists? Is it just opportunism, or are they being funded to do it, to steer the narrative? And is that why we face the censorship that we do in relationship to this? These are important questions, and I invite those people to do it. And I'll tell you this in relation to Jesse, the people around him and his dad, including the fact that his dad is partners with Gwyneth Paltrow in that ridiculous business, Goop. Yes, and Goop. Are you kidding me? I mean, do you realize that it's Goop and Gwyneth Paltrow that's riveting through the UFO field with Peter Thiel's bankrolled guy? I mean, this is really
his neighbor and best friend.
Well, I'm going to get into that.
Okay.
That, yeah, I could go off about that all night, but whoa. It's extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. But thank you for asking. But yeah, no, if
They're going to be curious now.
they're gonna, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, when you get around these people, it's very obvious. And in that case, it's Sam Bankman-Fried, who is Michael's best friend. Well, he's rotting in jail somewhere for ripping all these people off of crypto, and Michael's was singing his praises in an interview that he did with him. But he took that interview down. Well, I have a good copy of it, and I can listen. I can listen to it and read the transcript pretty clearly. You're promoting this guy and what he did, and you say, well, the only reason this guy never gives interviews, the only reason he gives interviews is because we grew up together and our dads are lawyers together. Yeah, So maybe you should put the Jesse, maybe you should put the episode back up and explain exactly why you took it down in the first place, and explain your relationship with Bankman-Fried. That's probably a good place to start. While you're at it, why don't you explain what Peter Thiel is doing, meddling in the UFO field, and why it used to be in your bio, investing with Peter Thiel, and you took it out. That's a little bit of a red flag, shall we say? I think we call it a red flag in the ethical world, but we'll see. If you have good answers for that, go forward. But what I don't like is the plagiarism, because what happens is they'll use the themes, they'll use the ideas, they'll take the exact episodes, and then they'll steer, the Thiel type money behind the things and do these really awful productions. But nonetheless, they know how to put the money and the stuff behind this. And so I think that stuff has to be, in this era where we're rolling into this kind of government launched version of disclosure, I think all this needs to be out front and on the table, because it's getting to a point where, there's too many sideshows going on in relation to this. So a lot of that needs to be explained. And I think we put some of that on the record here tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew. This is the Sphinx Atlantis Hall of Records Pyramid Breakthrough, going deep for you tonight on the work of Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner. Not goop. We're going to be taking a couple more questions, and I'm going to actually try to round out the thought here. But I can tell you this, with all the attention that the second Sphinx is getting, the crux really of the entire matter is the Hall of Records. And that, as we go along here, we start to see, this idea of just a Hall of Records directly beneath the Sphinx, the paw of the Sphinx. Actually, it's a much deeper story. Cayce says, well, that's the entrance, right paw of the Sphinx, and it goes directly to a pyramid of the Hall of Records, this Pyramid X, and that pyramid is between then the Sphinx and the Nile. So that helps us maybe go a little bit deeper. The things that they're seeing beneath that plateau are exactly what Cayce described as the channels being laid out. I'm going to go back to this Randall Stevens piece again. What do you got?
A lot of people have been asking this periodically. Red Boy Genie says, I'm sorry if I missed it. Did GJ say who the Sphinx base is? You haven't said it,
yes,
have you?
Right. I'm going to read the name. That's how we'll top it off here. All right, let's go back a little bit in time. Now, what's interesting is in his books, and this is now a little bit later after that original 36 book, this comes out later, and again, it's Randall Stevens, but here he's developing the half-sectional elevation of Sphinx, subterranean temple, causeway, and passages. The layout of the temples and the passages under the Sphinx, this drawing was made some 36 years ago, he claims. So the book where he puts this is 1952, which would put the drawing at 1926. Very interesting year. That's what he says. And then a lot of people said, well, did he just say that, but then they started to go back and look in time and see, well, no, maybe in fact he was putting this stuff out in that period, because there are early pamphlets and things where he's describing this. So I'm tending to think his timing is just about right. But anyway, here he has this vision of the Sphinx and the subterranean chamber beneath. Now that's Randall Stevens, and I will say that this is somebody who was very early on, like Cayce, with saying there's something very important beneath the Sphinx that relates directly to these initiates. there's a major discovery there to be had. So I think that we have someone in Stevens who's a genuine mystic, and he's getting the same information. So this is being kind of given out to these people, and it's being moved through small groups. Just like with Cayce, it's a small group, the ARE at the time, 1932, all the rest, post-depression. There's a few things that are out there. People know who Cayce is, but it is not, viral attention by any means. So you have these small groups developing this information, and over time it gets picked up. Like I said, long after Cayce's dead, some 20 years, we start to see, Jess Stern, best-selling, book, The Sleeping Prophet. It's got all this information about Earth changes, Atlantis, and all the rest of it. Well, guess what? People start to hook on to Cayce and Atlantis to such a point where even people like John Lennon become obsessed with Atlantis, and he goes to the Sphinx and he takes part in an investigation, an expedition to find the Hall of Records in 1977. All very extraordinary as we start to tie in the main figures starting to get involved with this. But you can see this consciousness about something underneath the Sphinx, something being secret and hidden there in Egypt, comes up at the same time Atlantis in the Bahamas is starting to come up. There's some consciousness rising, and I believe it's directly associated with these mystery groups giving out that information. Yeah, what do you got, Miss Olivia?
Kontiki Man, I have a piece of a question. Either Cayce believed in a deterministic universe, or he must have known that his readings would change the future, quote, history, telling about the Hall of Records. How could you go into that a little?
Cayce was, as you know, he's giving readings for people asking these questions. So he's not starting off with this great fascination of Egypt in his own time, in his own life. He is kind of concerned with other things. And he gets these questions. The questions start to come in, and they are using his subconscious mind to go dousing into these various subjects. And what happens, in fact, is at a certain point, he starts to open up about this Egyptian Atlantis past. And he's tracking the subconscious minds of the individuals who are asking the questions. At a certain point, someone actually asked him, where are you getting this information? And he said, from the subconscious mind of the individual who asked for the information. So that's particularly interesting to me when it comes to health, because when you get around the health, you realize, your own subconscious knows exactly what you need physically. Think about that. The various things that we're not tying into. This is the wonderful legacy, I'd say, of the Cayce work, which is he's giving us a hint that when it comes to these things, we already know. And I've put this on the record before when people have talked about, these military people have kept dead aliens or whatever. Look, if there was a military individual in the Roswell case who saw a dead alien, then unconsciously, we've all seen it. If all these people on the inside think they're keeping the secret, our subconscious minds are all connected on a certain level. These people, these cases have proven it. And so therefore, the idea of keeping a secret like that from humanity becomes absurd, right? But the secrecy is how they hold this power. And I think part of the imagination also is, the endless thing in your mind, like, you'll never get to see it. And so it creates a kind of impatience in people for disclosure and things. And I've seen this attitude. There was someone who wrote to me, and they said that basically they weren't able to focus because they were so obsessed with disclosure that they had lost their job. And they were describing these various things to me about their life. It didn't sound like things were very good. This type of obsession you do see around this. And you cannot, for me, any type of discovery of things relating to the UFO file or our ancient past or humanity's direction are all very practical, ultimately practical. Yeah, they're cosmic. There's no question about it. But if you turn off your life and responsibilities thinking that you're going to have a get out of jail free card with some fascination that you have with disclosure, Life doesn't work that way. It really does not.
Chop wood, carry water. I mean, it's very simple.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's very
regardless,
grounding.
You know, no matter what else,
Absolutely.
you can't get away with anything else. That's it. You got to take care of your responsibilities.
Okay, are you ready for the name of the person whose face is on the Sphinx? I hope I've set up enough of a sacred environment around what they were doing with laying the Hall of Records, putting up the Great Pyramid. I might do a separate show on the Great Pyramid and Ratta because it's quite fascinating, because Hermes, who many people assume is a god from Atlantis, and Ratta is saying, well, no, he's a high priest, like I'm a high priest. Well, people for some reason think he's a god. I think that's interesting. And Hermes is remembered as Thoth Tehuta. You know, he's this ancient Egyptian deity. Ra becomes an ancient Egyptian deity because of their incredible spiritual output in doing this. But Hermes, you know, is a name that's going to circulate and go through, and we're going to find all about Hermes that's the Greek term for the name. Well, it's very interesting because you've got Hermetic doctrine, you have Hermetic medicine, you know, all these things that come out of that. And then you have the emerald tablets of Hermes. So this is getting very deep. I think one of the things that's been suggested in all of this, and it was not confirmed by Cayce, so this is not something that he was putting forward, but that one of the lives of Jesus was Hermes. Now, Cayce did give some past lives of Jesus that were quite remarkable, including Amelia's. So, you know, this is a long journey of saving humanity there. But it's very interesting because Hermes comes up over and over again, setting up the Giza Plateau with Ratta, doing the cosmic alignments so that everything there works properly, setting the prophecies in the Great Pyramid, setting up the Hall of Records. And when you get it into that level, then you see, oh, the awakening that we're going through in this period, it's interesting because, like I said about King Tut's tomb in 1922, we never had anything that complete that we could see. And suddenly here's Akhenaten's son. And let's not forget Pharaoh Akhenaten worshiping the one god, Aten, while his Amun priesthood is worshiping 96, you know, crocodile gods and things of this nature. So there's something moving in all of this, just like the discovery of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, their relationship, Tut being his son, then the discovery of Tut's tomb tours everywhere. So people start to understand it's like our own memory kicking back in. So a lot of this process, it seems to me, is some kind of like subconscious magnetic attraction for these previous events. Okay, I promised you the name. And so we have the ceremony set up. They have put together the records of Atlantis. They've got the information on the TUAOI stone. They have how it works to contact the saintly realm. And they have the entire background of spirits, encasement, and matter. And they're setting it up because they know this is the beginning of a new root race epoch. This is a new time. Humanity's off to a new journey. And we're past the Atlantean destruction and the Belial destruction. The might makes right takeover. And in fact, the Belial group wins the war against the Amelia's group, but their victory is ashes in their mouth. They've destroyed everything and pulled it all down. Okay. The name is Asriao. And I'm going to spell that for you. Asriaio. There might be a couple of people who would volunteer a different pronunciation, but I've gone through a couple of different ones. Asriao, the chief counselor to the ruler in Egypt, during the period when there was the completion of the memorial standing as the mystery of the ages today, the Sphinx. And this, as is seen, represents this counselor to the king, for as is seen in the figure itself, not as one of the kings made into a beast form, yet overseeing, supervising, giving counsel, giving strength to the kings before and the kings since. Now, this figure, Osriao, he is an incredible mystic himself, and he is like a co-regent with the pharaoh. And because he gives such counsel, such as like Solomon Wisdom Council, and is such a major process of coordinating the Atlanteans in, there's a gigantic civil war that takes place when the Atlanteans come into Egypt. That's the backdrop of this story. That's why Ratta gets banished. And the Atlanteans come in with the things, the automatons, the untouchables, scientific cyborg mixtures. And they're like, these are basically our slaves. They do everything for us. So it gives them this weird advantage. And at a certain point, they take the native population of the Egyptians and they start treating them like the automatons. So this is a gigantic backdrop to all of this. Somehow this figure navigates all of this and gets Ratta back. And Ratta and Hermes set up the Giza Plateau. So that is why his face is there, adorned on the front of the Sphinx. But the symbolism of the Sphinx is a deeper subject. And very interestingly enough, I have a fantastic quote from Steiner on that symbolism. So I will read that before we're done. The face, even as was given then, is the representation of this counselor to this great people. These and many findings as given will be found on the base of the left forearm or leg of the prostrate beast in the base of the foundation, not in the underground channel as was opened by the ruler many years or centuries later, but in the true base, or that as would be termed in the present parlance, the cornerstone. The council of the entity brought much good to the people, not only of that land, but many others. And in the exaltation of the ideals set by this counselor, in the descendants of the counselor, brought in that land that became destructive to other fields, the same that had in the land lost of Atlantis. So somehow, it's very interesting. This is the last gasp of the Atlantean technology going on here too. This is another story going on. But what happens is that face that's on the Sphinx, he's so advanced, and the initiates have decided, you know, we're going to put the technology away. We're going to bury the TUAOI stone and all the rest of it. There's an effort here after he does all this incredible work to preserve for the public the essence of the good technology. And there's a little thing, there's an episode that happens here with his descendants where somehow one of the lesser priesthoods gets their hands on the technology and something happens. And Cayce is saying, he doesn't exactly say what it is, but he says it becomes destructive in other fields of that land, like the lost Atlantis. So somehow somebody pulled off a mini Firestone incident and it went bad again. So the technology gets lost forever. And they asked the question, what was the mode of transportation during this period in Egypt? I find this fascinating. Now, this is when they made the Sphinx. Here's what he says. In this period, there was a portion of the lost forces, as were seen in the lighter than air force of the force, as given, also propelling in water. Now, this is part of the lost forces. So the ability for flight, the ability to use the TUAOI stone. They're still the mode of transportation. They're still using it, but it's the lost. It's the end. And then they say, what was the mode of transportation for the emissaries to this notable gathering? And he says, the lighter than air. So then there's a few things here I want to add in relation to the Great Pyramid. But basically, there are years that are associated with what the Great Pyramid is. And the year 1932 shows up. I made a list of these years because I find them curious, but they're all related to the Great Pyramid. And here they are. 1932, 1936, 1938, 1958 the emphasis, 1958, 1998. So the pyramid is predicting that whole arc of when we go through the world wars. And there's a shift there in 1936 of the Earth's position in space. So the mystery groups are aware of this. That shift will eventually, say over the course of 100, 150 years, change the poles, cause Earth changes, etc. This is the nature of where we are in all of this. But Cayce's saying it's all there, predicted in the pyramid. And the other years that are in there, 2001. Now, it's interesting because the 2020s come up. There's no specific reference to what year that is. And then 2100 AD. So those are all in there for some reason. But my guess around the 2020s is that this is the period, just like Steiner was saying, you know what? It's not, he dies now in 1925. And the anniversary of his death, the 101st anniversary was on March 30th. But what he says is if you look out there, you know, this is after World War I and everything. And he is really down thinking the mystery schools and anthroposophy have failed because of these world wars. And he says, we're going to have a chance again, though. The whole thing will have a chance again. Anthroposophy, spiritual science, in 100 years. Well, here we are in that window. And here's Cayce saying, you know, you're in the window and this stuff can rise again. So we're in that crucial period and crucial window. I do think there were earlier attempts and maybe earlier opportunities for the Hall of Records to come forward, but the culture apparently has not been ready for it, or the ball was dropped in some regard. But here we are again. And I do think that it's incredibly exciting. It feels like an unstoppable force on some level. However, it also appears that in order to kind of prevent this type of awakening, they've decided they're going to set the whole world on fire. So I'd say we're right halfway between these two different realities. And Miss Olivia, with that, I'll take your last couple of questions.
Michael, could the Hall of Records contain plasma/anti-gravity devices along with a TUAOI stone?
I think there'll probably be things in there that we won't immediately understand what they are. But if Cayce's talking, remember the TUAOI stone is a gigantic thing. So I don't think the entire TUAOI stone is in the Hall of Records. I think that Cayce says the information for the construction of Sphinx, maybe telling exactly what kind of crystal it was, etc. And how to align it with the sun and stars. The way I look at it, what's going on there is we might think, well, the TUAOI stone is one aspect, really, of all this. But they're probably referring to the TUAOI spiritual aspect and how that would, you know, be used as a way to interface again as we once did. So, you know, as I've said, pop open your laptop and there's an ascended master there. Master Hilarion is there waiting to help you with your taxes. Yeah.
Harvardian, DJ, how likely is it that the breakaway civilization already have laid their paws on the Hall of Records?
I think through Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner, who I think are part of this, you know, GIZA Gate aspect, I think that they did try. And I think that what's interesting is not only did Cayce say that the Sphinx was a sentinel, but he said that there were sentinels guarding the Hall of Records. So there was a certain type of purification that was required for the people who were going to go in there and do this. And if you don't have that purification to go in and do it, it's probably like an Ark of the Covenant situation. You're going to get fried. And maybe they tried to get their hands on it and got fried. But as I've put on the record with Lehner and Zahi Hawass, they took massive amounts of money from the Cayce Foundation and trashed them publicly repeatedly to try to pretend that Cayce's prophecies wouldn't come true. And Lehner became the main stumbling block. Now, I'll tell you about Mark Lehner just briefly here. Mark Lehner was a high school dropout hippie who became the boyfriend of Hugh Lynn Cayce's daughter. And he expressed his interest in Egypt and all the rest of it. And Hugh Lynn thought to himself, you know what I can do? I can actually put this kid through college and he could be my man in Cairo. We can get to the Hall of Records and all this kind of stuff. So the guy gets funded through college. He goes through Chicago University, and then they put him in Cairo University, all this stuff. He gets on that plane, the Giza Plateau, controlling it with Zahi Hawass. Zahi Hawass has been put through college in Pennsylvania, and the ARE has donated to him over and over and over again for digs and all this other stuff. And those two together lock out all the people who are trying to prove the dating system is different. And that, you have a geologist there, Robert Schoch, very famously, everyone knows Schoch, who studies this. And he was the first guy who said the weather pattern on top of the Sphinx is rain. We didn't have rain in Egypt till 10,000, all the way back to 10,500 BC. How does that work? The archaeoastronomy, when they're starting to do that on the Sphinx, what was it the Sphinx was looking out at in 10,500 BC? The constellation of Leo. Well, he's in the body of a lion. So the archaeoastronomy is lining up. As soon as they got these people involved, the pushback became dramatic, and the whitewash was on. And you had people, like I said at the beginning of the program, like Hawass, who were celebrated, as Indiana Jones and all this stuff. In the meantime, he was accused of bribery under the Mubarak administration. Mubarak got put in jail for all kinds of crimes. And this guy was known, Hawass was known as basically this dictator and the person who would make sure that, you didn't get access to this or that. And he kicked people like Robert Bivol off the plateau. I mean, ridiculous stuff. All this negativity towards Graham Hancock and others. Now, the thing is, there are a lot of people, like these are the public people. There's a lot of people behind the scenes controlling these things. And there's tremendous amounts of money and influence that are involved. So we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go. But it's a disgrace, but that's the nature of the situation that they were up against. And so to answer your question, I think they certainly made attempts to get at that. Now, here's what's interesting, as I've put on the record in the 1980s, and this is a CIA file that's come out, so it's on record, okay? In the 1980s, the CIA implanted agents in the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and their job was to go in there and find out about the Hall of Records. So they come in there and they say like, hey, I want to volunteer. I'm interested in the Cayce work. And they just hang around and they listen and look through the readings for information about the Hall of Records. Why the CIA was interested in the Hall of Records and going to the Cayce Foundation in relation to this is very interesting to me, because the guy that I mentioned earlier, who was in charge of TTSA, Jim Semivan, who was a deep CIA directorate guy for 25 years. And he said, oh, I was abducted, and all the rest of it. And he said, yeah, he's doing this interview about it, like, oh yeah, this being showed up in my room and all the rest of it. And he said, it's interesting. Me and my wife had just come from a Cayce Ancient Civilizations lecture. So Jim Semivan, who angled himself in with the TTSA, created the false UFO threat operation. He was embedding himself over in the Cayce Foundation at an Ancient Mysteries conference. What is Jim Semivan doing at the Cayce Foundation? And then he claims while he's there, he has an alien abduction. I mean, this stuff, you just look a little bit at what they're manipulating here. You've got archaeology wars. It's major. And you start to wonder, where is it that they're taking this? And the secrecy around the UFO file and the pushback around the Hall of Records aspect and the way that they keep those things in a particular type of narrative now that they're out there more and more, I think is absolutely fascinating. It goes to the heart of what we're talking about, which is narrative control around these subjects. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question, please.
Very last question?
Yep.
Okay, well, I have to combine these two. Twilight Miss says psychic sentinels or physical sentinels. And Blue Man 2012 says, DJ, could the records be like the Hall of Records on the astral plane?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because he did say you could tap into them mentally, but he says there's a absolute physical counterpart. But if you get a good enough psychic, yes, you could go in. If you had the right intention and wanted to learn, he literally is pointing people in that direction. This is the quote from Steiner about the Sphinx on almost a cosmological human development level, which I found very interesting. Here we go. When man had not yet descended so far into the physical plane, he could learn what was experienced in the spiritual world. There, the candidate became acquainted with the true form of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. The initiate saw the contents of the myths during this journey into the spiritual world. He could then transmit this to other persons when he addressed it as myth or saga. He saw all this. He saw in what a special way the Osiris influence had shaped themselves when the moon had withdrawn from the earth. He saw how Horus issued from Isis and Osiris. He saw the four human types, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the true man. He also saw what happened to man between death and a new birth. The Sphinx appeared to him as a real form. He experienced it. He could say, I have seen the Sphinx, man, as he was when he still had an animal-like form in his etheric body, similar to the human, only projected out of this animal-like form. The Sphinx was a real experience for the initiate. He even heard the question of the Sphinx with its enigmatic content. He saw how the human body prepared itself out of this animality. At a time when the head was only an etheric form, the ether head of the Sphinx. This was the truth of the initiate, as were also the older forms of the gods who had, so to speak, taken a different course of evolution. Now remember, Steiner and Cayce said animals were here on Earth long, long time before humanity. And what's happening when they're seeing the etheric form of the human being, but they have, this version of all these gods and they have animal heads of different types. They're using these forms. They're substituting these forms because when they're starting out there, when you're looking back in that period, there is no humanity to look at. It's in the etheric. So what's interesting is Steiner is saying that the Sphinx basically encapsulates that entire journey from the spiritual into the physical. And the interesting thing for me is that the Sphinx as a lion, Steiner, if you go back enough into his material about what lions were in our own development, is that we basically adopted, we're not descended from the animals. It's very, very clear, regardless of, certain types of academic backgrounds on this. On the mystery side, there's no question at all. We do not descend from animals, but we have a lot in common with them. And the aspect that we have in common with the lion is the heart. And I found that very, very interesting because it's the lion that gives us the heart. And that's where we get this idea of the lion, the brave lion. And the fact that the Sphinx then is the brave heart of the lion with the human head, and it's protecting the human history. I think he is ideal then as a sentinel, as a symbol in that sense. And I think that when we get into the ancient aspect of the Sphinx, it was funny because John Anthony West said, according to his own research, that the Sphinx is probably 30, 40,000. Well, I think the reason that happens is quite interesting because, again, they were doing archaeology. That plateau, the whole thing, was built up in a much earlier period. So, in fact, it's correct to say the plateau goes back much, much further, probably 50,000 BC, probably an early Atlantis period. But the 10,500 BC is when you get the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx and laying out the Hall of Records on that sacred spot. So they were doing their archaeology. Now we're doing our archaeology, and this is 2026, and Cayce's back there giving us the hint. It's all there. It's all there underneath the right paw of the Sphinx, if we're big enough to take it, as it were. And so you're going to see a lot of confusing reports in relation to this, but make no mistake about it, the Hall of Records is genuine. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
We have some book requests here. So
Yes.
Liminally Yours says, found a treasure trove of Atlantis books at a used bookstore. Can you guys put out a reading list for Atlantis? And Lane Grief says, kind of off subject, but DJ, what Steiner work would you recommend to read for these times regarding the eighth sphere and Ahriman, etc.?
Well, an outline of occult science has all of the information about Ahriman and the old moon and all that. Cosmic Memory is the book you want to read in relation to lost civilizations and Atlantis and Lemuria, which we didn't even get into Lemuria. There's a wonderful video that Gigi Young did on Lemuria called, I think it's called The Scientists of Lemuria. It's a couple years old now. That is fantastic. You got to watch that. I have a quote here from the Orion Mystery, and this is when Baval was trying to get all this out about how, if you look, basically, the Great Pyramid and the lesser pyramids around it on the plateau are laid out exactly like Orion, and that this is what was going on. They were basically doing a cosmology from the ground to the top. And if you think about it, it's Baval, Schock, Hancock, and John Anthony West. They really, that's that version that comes in, and they are pushed back on. But this is an interesting little quote in here. So this comes from John Dixon, and the Dixons were the ones who brought over Cleopatra's Needle. They had done their own examinations in the pyramid. So many strange things about these Dixons in the 1870s. But here's something that they put on record, and it says, I am more than ever convinced of the probability of the entrance of a passage and probably a chamber containing possibly the records of the ancient founders. As soon as I have a decent plan drawn, I will send you a copy. Here in 1871 is a reference directly to the Hall of Records, and it's by Dixon. So you see, it's there, and it's not brought to the fore until we get to Cayce and this Paul of the Sphinx and all the rest. But I think that this is an incredible wave that's going on there. And if we search for it, we're going to find there are echoes of this hall or chamber that relate to that Atlantean past. So it's been going on for a long, long time. So we're in a period, you could say, of fulfillment. Mm-hmm. That's what I would call it. And your last question.
Well, I just wanted to throw this out there. Mark H.C. says, Edgar Cayce's Origin and Destiny of Man, terrific book on the Atlanteans' migration into Egypt and the Atlantean connection to the Yucatan and Pyrenees. Then your list is well read.
Thank you. Well, that's a great book, Origin. That's a 60s, 1960.
72.
72, yeah. Oh, boy. That one has all the Mayan stuff in it and the mound builders and stuff. It's an incredible book. It's amazing. And it was a guy who only wrote one book. His name was Jeffrey Furst, F-U-R-S-T. And it is Edgar Cayce on the life and times of Jesus. And you think you're going to go just in for Jesus. You've got all of the Atlantis background. You have all this pyramid stuff. It's an extraordinary book. And it probably uses the readings more than any other book. Very often you have somebody who's trying to sort some things out, and they do a good job. They'll work things in there, and then they'll have a little blip of a reading here, a little tiny thing. Well, if you read Jeffrey Furst's book, it's all like tons and tons of readings. And the Edgar Cayce on Atlantis by Edgar Evans Cayce, which is really, that's 1968, and it sets off this whole other wave after Stern's book. That's the book that John Lennon was obsessed with, and what got him to be such an advocate for the Hall of Records, and why he's out there buying lots in the Atlantic Ocean for the rising Atlantis. This is pointed out in the Cayce readings. I wanted to mention this. Now, there is something called the Queen's Mine in Bisbee, Arizona, and Cayce said that the Atlanteans would mine there various copper ores there. This is azurite, and it's known as the singing stone. This stone is 7 tons. And anyone who has been near it at the Natural Museum in New York City had always said there was a weird thing about it where the stone itself was singing. So there's an incredible period there, and I've done Cayce on Arizona, where he goes to this mine and all these bizarre mystical experiences happen to him. But I'll tell you what's interesting about this. This, to me, when we get around the TUAOI stone, I start to think of this azurite, the true lapis, as Cayce called it. And I think that that stone, which plays such a figure in a major chapter of Cayce's history, when he goes to Bisbee and has these extraordinary visions where his readings start to become actual tangible visions where other people can see them. I mean, it's an incredible story when he goes down there. And he goes down there with the guy who invented FM radio. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is it seems like if the Atlanteans are there and they were mining this, and then, you know, you have all these things about the Queen's mine. So I did some history on the Queen's mine, and it turns out that at a certain point, it was churning out more copper than anything else in the entire world. And then all these very interesting people were living there as well. Then suddenly, even with the copper intact, they closed the mine, and it's been shut for a long, long time. But in these readings Cayce was getting, there was all of these things about this stone, and this stone was pulled directly out of that mine. Now, a little addendum at the end of that. Someone went to go find this stone, and they found out that the stone had been moved to a room where there was no sunlight. And they observed that people no longer said that it sang, because for some reason there's something about the sun coming through that makes that stone sing. Wouldn't you like to hear what it sounds like? Well, I sure would. But I think that's fascinating. Isn't it incredible? The singing stone.
I can't look at that thing. I start
It puts you,
to leave
yes.
my body. I start to float up. I can feel it.
I used to get lightheaded with a little tiny bit of lapis around my neck. Oh, this thing would probably send me into another universe. Everyone, with that, we will wrap up the show. But Miss Olivia, what else you got?
You want another
Sure.
question?
Yes. We'll take one more question.
Oh, God. Okay. I didn't expect another one. Hold on.
Whatever you got.
Sorry, I've got a little trolling I've got to handle.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I did want you to have an opportunity to address this. So Ray Story says, Avi Loeb said that living underground makes more sense than leaving Earth during a cosmic event like a comet or pole flip during a solar flare on his YouTube channel today.
For once, I agree with him. Yeah.
Why would he bring that up now?
Whoa. Yeah, well, makes you wonder. It just, it is one of those things. Loeb was in charge. He's just been put in charge of doing the data mining for how people would respond to AI, alien coming here, and attributing all of these different things to an AI space alien ship coming in. Loeb comes out of Talpiot, Israeli intelligence, and he's an unusual figure. As soon as he got his board together on Galileo, maybe he thought this was a strategic move, but he put all the CIA counterintelligence people on his board. Because when I first heard of his board, I was like, this is interesting. They're all scientists, and they're all like 3 blocks away from me. This is going to be interesting. And then they all turned out to be, his lab is all the Galileo people are, counterintelligence people. So for some reason, he stacked the deck of his board with all of these intel people. I'll tell you, not only is intelligence involved so much with all of these things, but they are so openly involved now that I think they literally are just kind of coming out of the closet. Yeah.
Jay Smart says, go egg his lab.
No. I've been very, very polite, but wow, it's pretty extraordinary. And it is weird. The only thing that was really weird was Elizondo came here to commemorate them putting the new telescope on top of Avi's lab so they could spot UAPs. And so they had like Mellon and Elizondo and Loeb over there doing some ceremony. And, you know, I'm going back and forth trying to get my coffee or whatever. It's just like, it's too much. I will end this on a funny note here. This is all about something called mummy food. If you know about the Cayce readings, you know about mummy food. It is Syrian dates, black figs, and dates and cornmeal and goat milk, chopped very finely and mixed together into this kind of super psychic food. But here's where it comes from. It's Cayce's dream about waking up and finding a mummy at the ARE. I was at home in Virginia Beach, and there was a strong room built to the side and in the rear of the front of the house. In it were great stacks of tablets, about 11 by 14, an inch thick, clay tablets, all written in hieroglyphics. Especially noted that they were numbered from 1 to 3 in what appeared to be Roman characters, but the rest were something different. There was a mummy. All of these had been allowed to be brought back here by an expedition that had been sent out by our association, the ARE. I remained with these findings and could hardly be persuaded to go away, even to eat or do anything but study them. The members of the board of the association were arriving at the beach, and so he sees them and all the rest. Then a very old man with a long white beard, inclined to be stooped and rather tall, had a turban that was black and gold and seemingly moon stars or star or crescent, and a very flat turban. Mr. Gates was there, had a lot of them, but all seemed to be executives of some large group. And then these other people that he knows. Miss Wynne was very busy and talking to all these people and all the rest. And he's very detailed when he writes here as well. So he goes, I'll try to get to the core of the thing. So at a certain point, he wakes up and then he goes back to sleep and the dream continues. It seems there had been a reading to try to interpret the first tablet that seemed to be the key that no one had been able to interpret. And there were such crowds that they had been insistent that my son, Hugh Lynn, tell the crowd what had been said. I was alone in this place with the tablets and the figure when I realized the figure was beginning to come to life. The mummy was coming to life. The figure had been dark and apparently painted over and began to crack off like a shell. I saw the upper left side of the face and the left eye break first. The figure was coming to life. And it was perfectly white, very dark hair, very blue eyes. Gradually, I began to see as I took the top off that the paint was cracking off all over. I wondered how it could possibly come to life, as I thought within myself that all of the organs had been removed when it was embalmed. But it was very apparent that they had not been. It gradually kept moving and moving until there was something like a convulsion. And the figure sat up. It spoke, but I couldn't understand the language. Apparently then, from just under its arms to its knees, as it climbed out of the box, it was wrapped in a very fine linen. As I understood from the motions that it wanted water, I gave it a sip of water, and then I made a motion that I was to throw a quantity of water upon it. I drew a bucket of water and dashed it over the whole body, and it became clear, clean-looking, and began to make motions and signs to me until I could understand it was saying. It was almost like sign language to interpret the language. I could understand. It asked for food, and it told me I must have ground figs, dates, and cornmeal cooked in it with milk. When I prepared it and gave a little bit of the time, I knew Hugh Lynn was talking over in the large building. And so he goes on, and he's sort of trying to figure out what should I do. And then he goes over and he holds up his left hand, and he puts left in all caps, which I think is interesting. I didn't approach the platform very close. I called Hugh Lynn to come at once, and the figure was alive. Hundreds of people in the building fainted. Others fell back away from me. As Hugh Lynn came down and joined me, as we walked over to the place, that's when I woke up. I was with the risen lady. This is another continuation of the dream now the next night. He's with the risen lady and one who had come to life in the strange room, reading the tablets. And we had come to where she had said, I want all of those who feel they were in Egypt from what you have given, and we will see how well the actual record here tallies with the interpretations of these same from what you gave. Outside, there was more and more of people, and Hugh Lynn was keeping the people back. Dave and Edgar Evans were making arrangements with reporters, so he goes on. And then all of these people were there, motion picture people, in interviews. They wanted contracts, some very high figures. They were very insistent to all of those who were standing guard, as it were, at the door, that we must begin to give interviews and pictures. The girl or figure couldn't understand why she was so unusual. They began to clamor from the outside, and they would not be examined. And they had not even examined the casket or the sarcophagus. They were questioning Hugh Lynn and Edith and Florence, especially. That's when I woke up. It's a weird dream that he's sort of like trapped in this room with this mummy, and the mummy's like, make me dates and figs. And later he gets a reading on it. And the reading says the dates and the figs and the cornmeal were basically ways for the Atlanteans to raise their psychic potential. And that's basically a psychic food. Take it or leave it. But very strange dream on Cayce's side. With that, Miss Olivia, you're super.
In a second, Michael Bellinger has 2 suggestions for books.
Yes.
And that is Dweller on Two Worlds.
Of course.
And The Romance of Atlantis by Taylor Caldwell.
Yeah, she wrote it with Jess Stern. I have her whole book series. It is strange. It's very strange.
Supposedly she was Salustra, the last princess of Atlantis as it was sinking in a past life.
Yes, and she had a whole Atlantis obsession. She's a very famous, well-known romance mystery writer, and she got hooked into this, and she wrote a series of Atlantis books with Jess Stern, who wrote the best-selling nonfiction book about Cayce. I don't know how those Atlantis books did, but they're strange. They're very unusual. I found the whole set of books at a certain point, and yeah, Taylor Caldwell, very, very odd, very interesting. Dweller on Two Worlds, that's Philos the Tibetan, right? Mm-hmm. Tibetan. And that is such an interesting book because it talks all about the airships and everything else. The book was written in 1890, and it was written by a 14-year-old. And this basically figure came to him and gave him all this information. It's a strange and very, very intense book. Going through the past lives of this person in Atlantis. And when they're in Atlantis, they've got everything. Subways, they're going subterranean. And I mean, it's pretty incredible, subs and planes and all this incredibly high-tech stuff, airships. So I don't know how you explain a book like that without it being his past life memory, but I'm open for suggestions. Very strange book because a lot of it takes place around the gold rush in California, because that's the other life that this person has. So it dances between the Atlantean life and this gold, lust for gold. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. They should make a movie out of that. I've always loved that book.
Yeah. Or a series. Right?
Or Cayce's life. Can we have a life of Edgar Cayce? How about flashing back to when he was Ratta, the high priest making the Grand Pyramid?
Then everybody will start to meditate, and they don't want that.
Ah. You know what else you could do with Cayce is the life that he had previous to being Cayce was John Bainbridge. And one of the reasons he was so destitute in this life, apparently, is that Bainbridge had the same psychic ability, but used it to rig card games and things of this nature, and kept himself going in this kind of...
what was the wheel? Is that called?
Roulette wheel.
Roulette wheel, yeah. Right? He would do that. Mm-hmm.
He was a real ne'er-do-well, as it were, and a gambler. And it's very interesting. A lot of people who study the past lives of Cayce, there are 2 lives as John Bainbridge within 100 years of each other. Same name, same country. That's weird. And he also has a life in Greece, and of course, but I think Ratta is most famous life for sure. And Ratta's not even, he's part something else. He's part, Watcher or Sons of God or something, because he doesn't have a human father, or his mother doesn't have a human father. This is the question. So the way the reading goes is Rata's mother is a daughter of Zu, and then there's a comment about he doesn't have a human father. So they didn't know if it was talking about Rata or if she was the one who, was kind of like a virgin birth or something. There's something unusual there, but for sure, the interpretation that I have is that it's Rata who doesn't have a human father, and that the mother's a daughter of Zu, and that's why he doesn't. So there's some explanation in there, but it sounds like there's an Elohim involved with Rata. That would be my guess.
Okay. All
Yes.
set for super chats?
Super chats. Go for it.
Okay. All right.
I'll go all night.
All right. Harry Zeri, Ramblin' Lamb, Thomas Ball, Eurythmia's Fun, Bricklayer's Daughter, Zabinator, Emerald Gunrunner, J.M. Parsons, Tubatorium, DTM 190, HWT Jr., Weekend at Bernie's, Diana Dawn, Blazin' River, Wolfgang McCarthy, Mermaid Moxie, Real Norman Smith, Pete DeSalvo, Erica Swenson Elliott, Helena Wilcox, Brooklyn NW, Leo Roaring Ohm, Behold a Pale Horse, Nulthan, the Buddhas of Boston Sports, Harvardian, Debbie McAdoo, Leslie Garola, and Professor Hamamoto. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. I appreciate it. One of our followers on X, I don't know the name right off the bat, but I did take a snap of what they put up here. I thought this was great. And I will,
awesome.
Yeah, I'll get the name, but you did a great job with that. And of course, we have in there, if you take a real look, Cayce and Polina Zalitsky, the Hot Zone, and Ghislaine Maxwell. And so nice job. Great job. And I'll make sure to tweet that on X as well. Fantastic to be with you, everyone.
Can we blow that up and make it big?
Yes.
That'd
Oh
be
yeah.
great,
Yeah,
like poster
absolutely.
size.
It's
That'd
got
be awesome.
great things on here. He's got Aerospace Giants funding Atlantis Hunt. That is the North American Rockwell episode. So he took all these various things from the Hot Zone episodes, and he's a regular viewer, but I've seen him out there, and that was particularly good. So wanted to make sure we did a shout out for that. Miss Olivia, he did a great job. And so those are all your super chats. I'll do a couple of shout outs before we go here. Did Edgar Cayce come back as DJ? Oh, that's great. Boy, we all know that there have been a lot of people running around saying, I'm Edgar Cayce reincarnated. We went through a lot of that, didn't we? All right. Hit the thumbs up button, everyone.
When is he supposed to reincarnate?
1998.
Okay.
So that would put him now at 28. Yeah. Yeah, it could well be. I think the guy who claimed to be Edgar Cayce is more like 60 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Oh, Daniel, you should write and produce a Cayce miniseries. Gee, that would be a lot of fun. That would be a lot of fun. There's great things about Cayce. I mean, his whole life is kind of magical. It's a struggle. Make no mistake about it. There's a famous story of Hewlin Cayce talking about when he goes to Ohio, which is the toughest part of Cayce's life, really. And he goes to Ohio, and his dad picks him up at the train station with newspapers in his jacket. Oh, that's getting pretty tough there.
Actually, if there's one thing that you would be a great consultant on, it would be that, more than anything else.
Oh, interesting. Well, no question about it. I'd love it. Was John Bainbridge the pirate? Well, he was he was definitely a ne'er-do-well. There's no question about that. And he was a soldier, and he ended up dying of thirst on a raft after being attacked by some Indians in Ohio. And his whole life revolved around Ohio. So it's interesting that Cayce went back there after the fact and had such a tough time. Instead of Boardwalk Empire, what about Cayce? This needs to happen. Absolutely. Wow. I'm right there with you. Sonora Airship Mysteries. Oh yeah. You know it. Fantastic. Great people out there today. We've got Blue Man 2012. We've got Vince Vegas. Wow. Fantastic group out there tonight.
Can you include a link to your Alex clips in tomorrow's newsletter?
No, I already did.
Oh, you did?
I already did. I did the entire show is right in the newsletter. So if you have the newsletter, just sign up for the newsletter. See, everything's in there. So the Alex episode that we did, the 2 hours, it's all there. The link is directly in the newsletter. Saturday Night Ideas from Rocked. Indeed, from Deep State, You're Fired. That's a great name. Fantastic. Wow, just a great crew out there tonight. I know Gigi was out there tonight. Fantastic. Remember, check out her latest occulted show, Off the Charts. Gigi Young, you know, her work is completely blowing this other stuff away, and everyone should know about the work that she's putting out there. It's a great combination of mystical work and taking a look at the landscape that we're in right now. And let's see. Yeah. Someone said that about Wilcock. That's great. Thank you, DJ and Olivia. Potent stuff tonight, indeed. Great to have you here with us. Someone says, I was DJ in a previous life. See? The Elvis story continues. Tell us another story, DJ. Indeed. I would love to. If we had all night, I sure would. God bless everyone. George Ivankovich. Wow. Great crew out there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Amazing. And thank you, everyone. Much love all from Alchemy by Angela. We will see you all next week. And it's been a great trek down to the Hall of Records. And I hope we understand just a little bit more about Cayce's incredible vision of our future, wrapped up with our ancient past. We will see you all next week. It says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
It never really ends. And never let it be for God. Once there was a Camelot, and there could be again, you know. So we'll see you all very, very soon. Till then, sleep tight.
God bless. Happy Easter.
Good night, everyone.